Yo, what's good, Shinobi Nation? Welcome back to Just a Shinobi, the home of the craziest Naruto What Ifs. Today we're jumping into part 2 of What If Naruto Was Trapped in a Time Loop. So strap in, because things are about to get explosive. If you're new to the channel, make sure to smash that subscribe button, hit the bell so you don't miss the next chapter, and share this video with your whole ninja squad. And of course, drop your theories in the comments. Your support is what keeps this shinobi grinding. Naruto stared at his new foxy accessories in horror. Do you like it? The demon's voice mocked from within his mind. I did some redecorating while I was out, it teased. I really think it brightens up this dreary old place. Don't you think so? Ho how? The boy pulled on one of his new ears. It hurt a lot. Careful, they're sensitive, the demon teased. What did you do? The boy cried out in shock. Oh, a bit of this, a bit of that, nothing really all that significant, the fox roared with mocking laughter. But how is it still here? The boy demanded. Find out for yourself, why don't you? His prisoner sniffed, knowing it was being cruel by not answering. Life really sucks sometimes. The first thing Naruto discovered the fox had done was when he tried to hide his new accessories, and bungled the technique twice in a row before he finally figured out what was wrong. Whatever the fox had done increased his chakra stores enormously, but he wasn't going to call that a good thing, as it had utterly destroyed his control. Where before it had been like trying to control a fire hose, now, when he called upon his chakra, it was like trying to aim a geyser. Yes, the force was many times greater, but without control all of that power was meaningless. It had set him back to his academy level, where he had the worst control of any would-be ninja in the village's history. With his ability to control his chakra this messed up, all of his techniques were shot. He couldn't even make more than 200 shadow clones. His basic clones were back to looking half dead. The boy sat down and wept when he discovered that. All of that hard work, all of that effort, gone. Just gone. Damn you, fox! He shouted inside of his mind. Don't talk like that, the demon scolded. I am not your enemy. I cannot be. I have sworn to destroy your enemies, and the Celestial Emperor forces us to keep our oaths. So when you proposed a bargain, and I agreed, and you paid my price, our deal was sealed. Even if the price was not all I'd been hoping, you still paid it, and I am still bound. Don't make any mistakes, I am not your friend. But I don't care to destroy myself, so I don't dare be your enemy either. There came some cruel chuckling. That doesn't mean I can't annoy or even torment you, however. But my friends. Come on, admit it, the demon teased. All of Konoha are your enemies. I only did my job by destroying them for you. The boy froze, thinking. But that means if Hinata gets murdered. Yes, he could feel the demon gloating, almost imagining the wide, toothy grin. That's what I'm hoping for. If she does get murdered again, I might just be let loose to go avenge her again. Naruto gathered himself enough to shoot a cruel jibe back. I wouldn't count on it, Fluffy. Since Orochimaru is out there, and you aren't free to go out and track down him. Why don't you give it a try? The demon shot back, angrily. Go and slit that pretty little neck of hers with your kunai. I just might be let loose to avenge her by killing you. Perhaps I'll get full freedom after all. Only an enemy would propose such a thing, Naruto sneered right back. Suddenly he could feel the demon's shock a moment before its pain. He was just as surprised as it was at this happening. Forgive me, it stuttered out between clenched teeth, still angry, but now in immense anguish as its powers started to turn upon itself. Why should I? He shot back the words it had used on him the other night. I'd be far better off if you were dead. And now. Don't be too hasty. It gasped out. I can still be useful. What? You're going to teach me some techniques? What would I care about useless human skills? It gasped out a silly, high-pitched whine as its pain jumped up to another threshold. What could you teach an ant about its profession? Naruto touched his lip, thinking of what he could ask for. A bloodline? I have none to offer. The fox writhed, lashing about worse than Sasuke did when he lost his balls. What would you do if an ant drone came and demanded you make it a queen? Then, If you don't have anything to offer, he teased it right back. I know mysteries of life beyond everything your human medics have to offer. It screamed, actually eating itself out from the inside now. But how many apply to humans? The fox did not answer, writhing in torment. Perhaps it had no answer. Naruto grinned. The fox was going to die, and by the looks of it he was going to be free of his prisoner forever. Master! It called out in agony. Forgive your humble slave! He thought about that for a moment. Okay. As soon as that, the demon's pain was over. So, Naruto cheerfully shot back. What can you do to give me my chakra control back? But he got no answer. On investigation, he found his passenger comatose from oath-inflicted injuries, closer to destruction than he would have thought. It looked like he'd caught it barely a heartbeat short of death, and in a way that its own tremendous power could not immediately fix. Made sense, in a way, as it had been its own tremendous power causing it. Great, the boy groused. Now I get the fox to do what I want, and what can it do? Nothing. It's too close to death. Faye, my life sucks sometimes. The boy stood, looking around his dingy old apartment, and sighed. Well, I can't stay here. If I miss the test, Kakashi and my team will come looking for me, and it will be worse if they find me like this. I can't go to the library in this condition, and I can't transform. All of my techniques are completely shot. Dang. It was back to stage 1. And he'd been so close. No brooding, he scolded himself. That way lies the Uchiha side. Well, glancing at his jacket, he picked it up and began to put it on. No way out but through sometimes. Let's see what the villagers think of this. Halfway through getting ready, Naruto already had on a wide, prankster grin. Naruto bounced down the road grinning like a loon, his new ears twitching every which way and tail swishing along merrily behind him. The reaction of the villagers was intense. While normally they glared and sneered at him, today that was accompanied by pasty white faces filled with fear. In fact, terror seemed to overcome hatred in most of those cases. Looking in the mirror after donning his clothes, newly tailored to fit his tail through a hole in the back, he discovered he had a total of 4 ears, his usual 2 on the sides of his head, and now this new set decorating the top. All of them were fully functional. In fact, the new set functioned like a pair of parabolic microphones, in that they could pick up sounds that were really faint or far away, so long as they were pointed that direction. And they kept twitching around uncontrollably. Naruto must have located 100 rats that he never noticed before on his way to the testing center. Oi! Hinata-chan! Wait up! We can walk the rest of the way together. He called out to his favorite person, and she stopped and waited for him. Amazingly, she didn't react at all to his foxy accessories, just smiling and happy to be walking with him. Must think there's some kind of prank, Naruto thought, then grinned even wider. Well, that is something I would do. At that, he could hardly repress a merry chuckle. Oh yes! He could do stuff with this. Naruto! Stop fooling around! Sakura called back to nag him on her way past to greet the Uchiha. Kiba, coming up to greet Hinata, as she was his teammate, looked Naruto up and down, then sniffed a couple of times. Oh, I don't get it, he told Naruto, scratching his own chin. You smell like a fox, and look like one, too. What's the gag? Naruto smiled so wide he had to close his eyes to make room for it as he shot his hand high and called out loud, Hey! I thought I'd have to be really clever to pass this test, and so I dressed the part. Half of the younger set broke out laughing, while some among the older ones looked on, horrified, but then they rolled their eyes and scowled at his bad taste. By noon it would be all over town that the clown had done it as a prank on everyone. This, from the inventor of the sexy technique, and it would be totally believable, too. Their anger would spike a bit, but the relief would largely drown it out. As they entered the testing zone together, his team plus Hinata's, which meant that Lee would not be making an appearance to fight Sasuke, they walked right up to the disguised team guarding the illusionary door. The pair turned pasty white upon spotting Naruto, and the gleeful genin raised his perfectly human nose to the air, declaring, Something smells fishy here. He smiled, baring his ordinary human teeth at the pair drew back, drawing weapons, hands trembling. Hinata-chan. Naruto dived toward her book bag. You didn't tell me you brought tuna. We'll have to go out to lunch together later. They gave heartfelt sighs and relaxed, while the crowds of genin looking on began laughing at their antics, and at Hinata's rosy blush. When they got outside the testing room door, Kakashi and Kurenai, who were waiting for them, saw Naruto among the kids and instantly stiffened, going from casual and relaxed stances to alert and battle-ready ones. Oi! Kakashi! Naruto called out, having one of the times of his life. I let the Kyuubi out last night to catch a rabbit and look at what he did to me. The two face-flopped. Naruto! Kakashi scolded, as the pair of teachers got up from the floor, rubbing their foreheads. You must not joke like that. Drop that disguise before someone hurts you for it. No! The boy laughingly retorted. I don't feel like it. He adopted a very unconvincing pose of sudden feral impulses. In fact, I can't, he wheezed out through exaggerated front teeth. I am being overcome by my impulses. The instincts of a fox are taking hold. I must kiss Hinata-chan. And he turned around and proceeded to do so, loudly, messily, and noisily, but to her great delight. The whiskers added an extra something to it, he was sure, as she never wriggled in enjoyment quite that way before. Kurenai put her face in her hand. Kakashi rolled his eyes and poofed away to go read porn. Naruto was grinning as he made out with Hinata right there in the hallway. By overacting, everyone assumed this was a prank. And they expected pranks from him. Especially ones in bad taste. This was working. When they entered the testing chamber, Naruto stood forth and challenged the entire room, shouting, Oi! My name is Naruto Uzumaki, living container for the nine-tailed demon fox. And he began to twitch, acting out spasms, the seal. It's breaking. It's breaking. Naruto! Sakura clobbered him on the head, knocking him down off of the top of the desk. So she scolded him where he lay on the floor. Don't make lame jokes like that. It isn't funny. The class, tense as brittle glass, relaxed at this statement, rolling their eyes and passing it off as just another lame joke from a class clown. It was priceless, one of the best jokes ever. He was very nearly admitting the truth and no one would believe him. It almost made up for utterly destroying his abilities as a ninja. Almost, but not quite. Getting up and rubbing his head a little, he caught the flat and hostile gazes of the Sand siblings from across the room. So he hopped over there directly. Hey! Gaara! How is Shikaku? Is the one-tailed demon raccoon treating you right? Can you tell him that Kyuubi says hi? What do you want? Gaara asked him low and level, his gaze hostile. To make out with your sister? The clown teased. Gaara blinked, nonplussed. Then he thought about it. All right. Naruto's face went slack in surprise. Gaara? Temari pleaded with her brother, plainly horrified. Demon containers need their lovin', he told her in flat, unemotional tones. Temari looked at her younger brother, terrified, before turning a wan smile on the blonde boy. So, where shall we do this? I dunno, the Konoha genin tempered, looking around for a way out of this. Spying his salvation on the other side of the room, he grinned. Hey! Hinata-chan! You've got girlfriend rights. So you have veto power. Do you mind if I make out with this sand chick here? Already turning back to tell Temari thanks, but no thanks, he heard Hinata stutter out behind him. And no, I'd say alright. His jaw practically scraped the floor. Turning back, he shouted, Hey! Are you sure? I'd hate to hurt your feelings. It's okay to tell me no. No, she stuttered, playing with her fingertips. It's alright. You go ahead. I wouldn't want to be your first time. So go ahead and do whatever. Her nerve broke and she hid behind Shino, who could outstare a carving. Naruto got a wan smile of his own, and turned back to the Sand siblings, where Gaara was looking at him with a well, get on with it expression. Naruto gulped. The Kyuubi container was utterly humiliated. First, the demon sends his chakra all out of whack, messing with his control so badly that it was impossible to reliably use any of his techniques except Shadow Clone, and that was down to 5% of his previous numbers. Having no control sucked. Then, they passed the written test as usual, and when they went on to the expected Orochimaru fight, Naruto had hung back, teasing Sasuke, and the creepy snake guy had beaten up Sasuke, bitten him, then let them pass. Worse yet, Sakura had hung all over the Uchiha all night long, when Naruto couldn't even get a camping technique to go right, and the screwy Uchiha had somehow managed to live through the night. So much for healing techniques. Apparently it was all Sakura, although what she did except fret and moisten his forehead with a rag was beyond the boy. No, that was a big-time blow to his ego. First, the fight was all Sasuke, then his survival was all Sakura. Wasn't anything he did going to matter? Didn't he make any difference in this town? Sometimes he just didn't know why he cared anymore. Getting beat up on by the sound team made him afraid, but when he fought Kiba in the preliminary matches, after having been saved out of the forest by Kabuto again, it got confirmed. His chakra control hadn't been all he'd lost. Somehow, when the demon beast had been out, it had done more than left him with fox ears. His body was now stronger and faster, and a few inches taller. He guessed that no one had noticed, mostly because of the ears. But while that could have been a good thing, it wasn't. Why? Because it had destroyed what martial arts ability he'd had. Oh, if he'd had the muscle memory, then he probably could have adapted. If it had come to him gradually, then he probably wouldn't even notice adapting to those changes. But coming at him all at once, when he still had to think through all of those complex motions, and now the motions he'd memorized were all slightly off. The boy took Hinata off to a corner so he could cry on her shoulder after losing his match against Kiba. His unarmed fighting skills were now worse than before, thrown off by his changes and not even having the brawling spirit he'd relied upon before. And he couldn't retrain until he had enough chakra control back to perform the needed transformations to disguise himself under. He'd not even been able to summon a fart when he needed one. No, in that match he'd been humiliated, and on top of that he'd felt terrible about not cheering Hinata on in her match against her cousin, when he knew she needed him to, but when doing so would have led to her getting hurt. Failing at the prelims was as far as he'd ever gotten, yet he'd lost everything to get there. And he hadn't even gotten through. A couple of resets worth of research had turned up several interesting things that concerned Naruto's new problem, while making no apparent difference in the nature of the injuries of the slumbering fox. Chakra had a spiritual component. One's chakra could also have a physical effect on the body, as that was where Naruto got both his original whisker marks, as well as his regeneration. Apparently, pulling off that seal had sent such a surge of the demon's chakra through his body that even after the reset, there was enough still free, added to his own, to have greatly amplified his already present marks. Either that or something about the surge of energy had imprinted on his chakra system the idea that his body ought to be more fox-like, and so his body had gone ahead and regenerated the missing pieces. It wasn't like there were books already written about this. Naruto had to do some guessing on his own, and he knew they might not be accurate. All of this research had to be performed on the sly, of course. The people at the library had already been bad enough without his changes. But, at least he got to practice his arts of stealth and information gathering during the odd times he was feverishly going over his chakra control exercises again, trying to regain some of what he'd lost. It would be a long route to get there, however. So he might as well practice his ordinary, non-chakra-powered techniques of simply sneaking around and hiding, working out with wires, what could be done without chakra to enhance their strength and lengthen and or contract them. It left him feeling like only half a ninja, at most. Naruto didn't have tons to do while slowly rebuilding his chakra control. All things seemed to wait on it, so he was at his wits' end the first couple of weeks trying to have something that could occupy his mind other than the interminable chakra training drills. He'd shown next to no progress during that time, and it was a matter of mental survival to find some way to distract himself from his frustrations. And no, Kyuubi hadn't shown any clear improvement in all that period. It might as well have been dead, except it wasn't. Naruto wasn't that lucky. So he began churning through books at the library at an increased pace, sneaking in and smuggling them out because they wouldn't let him inside, and one of those books was on metallurgy. That gave Naruto pause. Here he was bored practically out of his mind. The Uchiha lands had a couple of smithies on it, and shinobi did use weapons and armor. So, if he wanted to, this was something he could pursue while working to get his chakra control back. So he did it. Konoha did have several blacksmiths who repaired or created weapons and armor. At first, after finding out where those were, he did some spying on them to watch what they did, but that grew boring very quickly as what they did never changed on his unending day. So he gathered up what money he had and sent Hinata to special order things. The darling girl never objected to those requests, and felt privileged and honored to do so for him, no matter how weird it was what he wanted her to order, and whenever possible she'd kick in her own money to help. He loved that girl. No one else was like her. An entire town hated his guts, and she was the sweetest thing to him, in spite of having so little confidence herself. Anyway, with her help and some practice concealing himself so he could spy and observe, he got a smithing education. Most of the shops had apprentices, so often enough he could secretly listen as the master taught the younger smith, often a relative, how to do this or that, and parabolic ears were really useful to overhear what they were saying as they did so. Since the various shops that had apprentices had them at different levels, he could have Hinata order the same thing at different places each day to pick up more than he'd known before, starting with the basics. So, having picked up what he could by secretly observing and reading what he could from books, he figured out how to get Sarutobi to grant him the Uchiha properties in spite of his new appearance, picked up a hammer and went to work giving it a try. Only to immediately go back to hit the books and overhear some more, as he had obviously missed some important stuff. Then he had to struggle to figure out the pieces he couldn't arrange to overhear, but after that things got better. With lots of spare time to experiment in, he even got pretty good. It took him a while, but just about any ordinary person could be trained by a smith to be a smith in about 6 months, more if you wanted the specialized, detail-oriented stuff, and Naruto was anything but ordinary. He'd learned harder techniques faster, and with less help than he had here. Okay. Granted, the frequent resets were actually a detriment for him here as he had very little ability to see the progress of his own work, as what he couldn't make in a day and a half didn't happen, as he'd either reset or be off in the forest of death by then. So, still having ability to produce shadow clones, albeit much reduced, he put them to work helping him. He himself learned to make small pieces or bits of larger ones that he then put them to work crafting other days while he went on to learning other parts of those same projects. It was not long before he had a decent skill level, but he did not stop there. He had no reason to. There was more to learn and he was bored, so he began to go from the ordinary village smith level of pot hammer and nail maker on to crafting weapons and armor, as had originally interested him. It took him no time at all to find out that his tools sold to him by the villagers had to have been specially made to be as bad as they were. Cheap metal, dull blades nothing could effectively sharpen, and balance so bad it could not have been an accident. Naruto was crafting better on his first, clumsy attempts. Then, as he grew competent on basic ninja tools, he branched outwards, and outwards, finding himself working on swords and samurai armor, giant blades similar to Zabuza's gigantic cleaver, even branching out yet further making clocks and other intricate mechanisms. He even started crafting intricate little toys for himself. Why? Because there was more to learn and he was bored. Besides, he got to play with them, after. He got into a clock-making thing because many of the armor pieces had joints and fasteners more intricate than he could arrange to overhear instructions for, and the only books in the library he could find that dealt with small, precision things were about clock-making. So he did so. And then later lock-making, learning how to make all sorts of intricate things, from sturdy bolts to complicated puzzle locks granting far greater security than he'd ever enjoyed. Then, when he took that back to the armor pieces, he found he was actually quite good at it, really amazingly good at it. And, by necessity, he was fast. If he wasn't fast, the project couldn't get done, and he wouldn't learn if it was any good or not. Soon, his clones all working together and occupying 2 shops to do it, he could have himself wearing a full suit of armor in half a day. But as he did so, he found the stuff clunky and uncomfortable, restricting his movements and heavy so it slowed him down. And well, as he was already the one making it, he just fiddled with the designs a little, adding a little detail here, or adjusting a joint there, adapting a trick he'd learned from making joints on toy soldiers to make something less awkward and more comfortable to wear, and so on. There are several details restricting the nature of armor in general. One of those was the materials used, and he hadn't any unusual abilities there, but another was the skills of the craftsman involved, which in his case were shooting up remarkably fast as he wanted desperately for something to occupy his mind and so fiddled with everything, playing with details and doing the work over and over until he was becoming almost frightfully good. And a further limiter on armor and weapon quality was the amount of time a smith was willing to put into not only creating it, but fine-tuning it to get it all right, personalizing the fittings for optimal use and flexibility by one individual. And well, time was something he had too much of. By the time he'd devised, and redevised, reworked and re-engineered every conceivable, and more than a couple of ridiculous, complete sets of ninja outfitting for himself, he began to do the same for Hinata, then Tenten, Ino, Temari, then Gaara and Kankuro until Kurenai chased him away when he approached her with a tape measure. He didn't want to outfit his teammates. They could go without as far as he was concerned. But anyone else was fair game, and he'd gotten a fair bit into creating a set for Shikamaru until he decided that didn't interest him anymore. It wasn't new any longer. Still, there was plenty to do with refining the sets he'd already started. He'd find pretexts to get those people to try on his work until he could confidently say he'd gotten them right. Only by then, his standards of right were pretty awesome, including a precisely calibrated fit and amazing balance. He got that good by having a great ability to learn, near infinite time available, plenty of willing help in the form of shadow clones who knew as much as he did, an inexhaustible supply of materials to work with as whatever he used one day was still available to him the next, and most people, when faced with a project, are willing to say good enough because they don't want to undo, then redo, all of the work they'd done before. And well, since Naruto had to redo all of that work anyway, there was never a good enough point to stop him. He'd also check for protective value, at first by hanging those suits of armor on dummies, then pounding them to scrap metal with swords, knives and other weapons, some he devised, but others he found lying around the Uchiha estate. And he wasn't satisfied if he could slip in a Saban needle before he'd warp the metal under his attacks. Then he went to work to devise armor that didn't warp so easily when he pounded on it. Why? Well, it seemed all he had was time, and it might matter someday. Also, he got to try and adapt what he knew of martial arts to his new body, thinking through each step and trying to compensate for his changes, while he pounded those armor sets to scrap as targets. It didn't have the ease or satisfaction of getting taught, but it was doing some good. If nothing else, it made him not feel so trapped and helpless. It was hard to describe his disappointment over losing the use of his chakra techniques, but this smithing, and to a lesser degree, martial arts, was a skill he could keep so long as he still had all of his limbs and a sound body, none of which he was likely to lose so long as he could regenerate. He'd learned that when Kakashi had blown a hole through his chest. During this time he was also practicing stealth and information gathering. Before, it had almost been too easy for him to shape-shift and then learn whatever secrets he wanted by being in the form of a student someone who had that knowledge wanted to teach. Now it was more difficult. Not only was he the demon brat, he had those stinking fox ears marking him even more distinctly, rendering him easy to notice even when he changed out of his orange jumpsuits and adopted less loud and obvious mannerisms. Still, being harder only made it so he had more to learn, and an admittedly more difficult time getting there. But he had a good start, from breaking in to steal the Uchiha scrolls and manuals on that subject, so he at least knew what he had to do in order to get started. Things like his waving tail gave him away at first, but even then he learned how to control and compensate for eventually. So he began hunting secrets. Not any particular secrets, just secrets in general. He began by breaking into the houses of Sasuke's fangirls to read their diaries, just on the odd chance that he could get something to help him understand why they all drooled over him so much. It didn't help much. Girl speak might as well have been a code. But code breaking was also a part of the ninja profession, so he went about breaking it, or trying to anyway. Soon he discovered that he was lacking the key, and in the principle of all code breaking, he needed to either find or divine the answers. So, out of that desire, he began to hang around bathhouses, a safe distance away, not peeking, just listening in to their conversations with his parabolic ears to see what they talked about when they were all alone. It was an entirely different language. The words were the same, but the meanings? Still, it had some use to him. There were often nuggets of insights in there, just buried under loads and loads of fluff. So he began doing the same tricks with ladies at restaurants, shopping, or hanging out with each other in all the places they'd go. Interesting, but even listening in on a whole village proved to be too small a sample over one day. He either had to find a way to observe over a longer space of time, impossible as he'd never yet gotten through the whole forest and the preliminary rounds, which always reset him, or find some ways to mix it up a little so that he could observe more conversations that weren't just repeats of what he'd overheard before. A little while ago he would have joined them using his sexy technique, just to be on hand to steer those conversations in more interesting ways. But that route was presently closed to him. So he had to give up on the great girl decode for now, leaving that until he had more options. What he did begin to find, as he broke into more houses searching for a wider variety of things, and getting caught on occasion, but those only stirred him up to learn more, he found recipes, which he enjoyed as they generally improved his cooking skill as well as his diet. Ino had only known so much to teach him, bank account numbers, wedding photos and all sorts of stuff, all of which he devoured. Then he happened upon a song. He'd always refused voice lessons during his time at the music store. As for the Uchiha, it would have been too far outside the role he'd been playing for it to be believed. But it was music and, here was the best part, it was not limited by what he could get his fingers to do. That's right, no muscle memory restrictions there. Oh, he couldn't properly condition his voice, but that was all right, as he couldn't condition his arms to throw kunai, either. Just like he couldn't go anywhere with those weight training books, or the flexibility training that all sounded so useful. He could lift all of the weights in the world and it couldn't do him any good, form splits until he bled and the next day there'd be no benefit. He could do all of the exercising he wanted, but in the end no matter the pain there would be no gain. It was that simple. But that was all right, he didn't have to worry about that, because there was still so much singing he could do without training to reach the real high-end vocal tricks and stuff. The villagers' eyes popped out of their heads when they woke up some mornings to a 200-voice choir that was all Naruto. Okay, he didn't have the different vocal sections, having only one voice, but it wasn't bad either. They could sing a shopping list if they had to, and make it sound good. And that mattered to him, as it began to feel like there was a crack in the glacier, that the wall that held him back now wasn't perfect, that it could be gotten through. He'd just have to find those teeny tiny cracks and widen them to do it. Naruto had learned, through frequent experience, as he'd actually had to play up the whole I am a fox angle in order for the older generation who knew about his condition to take the thing as a joke, that Temari didn't know how to kiss any better than Hinata-chan. There must be a lack of experience in both cases. After all, Hinata didn't have enough bravery to, and only liked him in any case, while the other was Gaara's sister, and so almost as much of an outcast and pariah as he was. The odd thing was, when he was not acting over the top and acting weird about it, the end of Konoha would all arrest and interrogate him for the day. So it was just easier to kiss Temari than think up new things to do each day that were sufficiently over the top to allay those suspicions. Oh well, the fox boy not only learned how to find and push her buttons until he could get her to squealing during the middle of an exam, having figured out what place in line he'd have to stand in order to sit next to her, but also how to do so before the test started, and in such a way that he could slip her the test answers so she didn't have to rely on Kankuro. Although leaving her hickeys on her inner arm in the shape of the answers proved to be too awkward, so he learned to find other methods. So when she adjusted her slightly disordered clothes and hair mussed up by cuddling, not anything particularly naughty, she just had a fragile hairstyle not having been previously tested against hugs, she'd find little slips of paper concealed on her with the answers already written on them. After she did so, she'd always give him an impressed look or two after the testing was over. Then he learned how to rig the seating arrangements so that Temari was sitting on the other side of him from Hinata, and that was best. For some strange reason, Hinata's lack of self-confidence would not let her believe that she was good enough for Naruto, thus why she'd never approached him before. And perversely, she felt much better about the whole girlfriend issue if there was another XX chromosome ally on her side, someone to take up any and all girlfriend duties Hinata herself might flub on. She felt so sure of her own failure in almost every department that she felt better about anything, particularly anything important like being a good girlfriend to her precious Naruto, if she could tag team it. That way her fears could be allayed, thinking that if she failed there would be another to take over, and thus between them make sure of getting it done properly. Yes, that's crazy. She'd never been anything less than everything Naruto had ever wanted, had ever imagined wanting. But she was not the first girl to want something that didn't make sense or go crazy over insecurities. The author himself has never ceased to be amazed over the amazing leaps of logic that particularly insecure girls are prone to, nor the outrageous and farcical plans they would come up with to pursue them. Still, while Hinata was whispering all this off in a corner in a desperate yet hushed conversation with Temari, Naruto was, perhaps unfairly, listening in with those amazingly useful fox ears, while she first confessed her fears and hopes for another girl to help her shoulder her girlfriend duties solidly. Then Temari confessed in turn that, although she thought Hinata was crazy, she was at least glad for it, as Gaara had told her that she must suitably cater to his fellow demon container's romantic needs or he would kill her. Who would have thought Gaara of being that crazy? Okay, he knew he was a demented lunatic, but that had always been on a mass murdering string. This new twist came out of left field. But coming from a guy who'd carved the kanji for love into his forehead. Well, the answer to that, in Naruto's mind, was pretty simple. He could set his romantic needs very low, that way Hinata could outgrow her fears of not being up to meeting them, and Temari would not have to do anything she found terribly distasteful. Yup. He was a kissing man from now on. With perhaps a hug or two, and that answer seemed to work best for them in what was an already bizarre arrangement. Even better when he got Sasuke to sit ahead of him so they could throw spitballs in his hair during the final crunch minutes while Ibiki was really cranking down the pressure, and the trio had already been kissing for 40 minutes straight, with Naruto trading between the two dizzy females, made so by his increasingly expert ministrations. Yes, he was getting to be that good of a kisser. Probably no man alive had had half so much practice, and he was a great learner. And best of all, Sakura was so busy being upset during these antics that she never even thought of volunteering to volunteer dropping out. And learning how to throw the spitballs without any of the examiners catching them was good ninja practice. But even after all of this, his chakra control was only barely crawling along. In the end, Naruto went to go ask the Hokage. Hey, old man, I've got a problem. Oh? Sarutobi took his pipe out of his mouth. What problem is it, Naruto? The boy sat down heavily, shaking his head and grabbing his own hair. I've got no idea how to explain this. The Hokage leaned back, appraising him. Apparently it was serious. Why don't you start at the beginning, Naruto? That would be really hard to do, the boy admitted with a sigh. Sarutobi was nodding. Serious and complicated. Fun. Why don't you just try? You'd be surprised what you can describe if only you get started. The boy sagged, listless, in his chair. Well, I don't expect you'll believe me. What do I do if you don't? The Hokage leaned forward, lacing his hands together on his desk. Why don't you try, and I'll do my best. The boy sighed before nodding. Given how sad and serious the blonde was, the Hokage was already certain that whatever it was bad. However, a large part of him had that parental hope that it was some childish nonsense that seems grave to a young mind, while being utterly inane to an adult one. Still, he didn't hold out too much hope for that, as those were very rarely the case with Naruto, who had problems no one seemed to have resolutions for. Still, it would be nice to have it be one of those for once. However, Naruto's first words confirmed it wasn't. Okay, first thing you've got to understand is that a time-space jutsu has gone massively wrong. I've been trapped in an endless time loop. Every day is the morning of the first test of the exam. That was the same yesterday, and it will be the same tomorrow, too. You won't recall any of this, because you never do. No one ever does. But I have lived through this one day for years now. Sarutobi's face grew grave. That is a very interesting problem, Naruto. Can you offer me any proof? The boy sighed, shaking his head, then looked guilty. Maybe, but not yet. I've got to finish my explanation first. The Hokage nodded patiently. Then proceed. Gulping, Naruto continued. It's not always only one day. When I pass a phase of the exam, I am allowed to go on until the next one, but the moment I fail any part, one gets sent right back to the beginning. Sarutobi stopped himself from smirking. So, that was the game, was it? It had been a while since Naruto had tried to pull a prank on him, and he had to grant him points for originality. But really, the premise was transparent. He was angling for an easy promotion and an excuse to skip the exams. Not a bad idea for a genin. Well, best to see how this played out. Sighing once more, the boy groaned, face down, heavy with sorrow. The Hokage really had to give him points for the act, it was most convincing. Ebisu had been right, drawing was a perfect method for meditating on the beauty of nature. Naruto had almost forgotten about that suggestion. It had been so long since he'd seen the special, as the teaching specialist only gave him advice he had already heard. And since he couldn't adequately fake walking on walls, water or leaf floating, until he could do them up to Ebisu's standards, he could forget about any other training from the man. And once he did, he could look forward to more focusing on the basic 3 ninja techniques. So, the one teacher who'd probably taught him more than all of the others combined was presently unavailable to him. That sucked. It honestly surprised him how much he needed this relief from all of his ninja training and duties, although it shouldn't have. He knew that he had been having a great deal of stress trying to break through his present barricades and get back, even to the level he'd been at before. But until he'd had some amount of relief from that anxiety, he hadn't realized how much it had been hurting or eating at him. He didn't even have to draw well, just looking at a thing, examining it, and so on allowed him to see it in ways he'd never thought of before. It was both a marvelous change and a desperately needed outlet, bringing relief so fast he could even forget sometimes what his worries were. This habit was a lifesaver, and so he did it, and as he did it he accumulated skill and got rapidly better at it. There really was no substitute for practice in this thing, but the same rules applied to this as had with his blacksmithing, namely, he had infinite time to try everything out, get it right, explore it, and he never run out of materials to work with, as a drawing pad was always empty the next day, also meaning that he never hit that good enough point. It was a good counterpoint to a major frustration he was having. So far he had been totally unable to convince the Hokage of the truth of what was going on. Even when he tried to less than fully explain the situation, telling him only parts, he'd either get frustrated out of getting no useful response, or bound to a table getting tested by Sarutobi and some of Konoha's best seal experts. Still, it was not as though that latter case was entirely useless, as Naruto merely spent the time listening to their dialogue, memorizing what he could of it, only to look up those words later. It was providing a spotty and haphazard education on the nature of the art of sealing, but he'd gone far with even less complete starts. It got even better when he had the idea, and figured out how to manage, just walking into the Hokage's office, grabbing a book seemingly at random, opening it also seemingly at random, and pretending to study while he was actually pouting. In truth, what he was doing was actually studying, but pretending to pout, and in the short amount of time that it took Sarutobi to pry him out of his shell to find out what was wrong, Naruto had had a few minutes to pick up some information out of those very high-level books. Too high-level, as it turned out. You couldn't build a structure from the top down, and he needed more of a base than he already had, so he begged and pleaded a few times and finally found out about the existence of a shinobi library of sorts. Really, he should have found out about it before. After all, he'd been to the special A and BU classrooms where they taught anatomy toward the aim of having better takedowns of target ninja, and it was all in that same building. It wasn't all that much of a library either, just a collection of teacher resources for the ANBU classes, and even so it had been carefully vetted to make sure that nothing above a certain security limit was in there to prevent theft or infiltration attempts from having too easy a target. And there were no real techniques in there for that reason. But what it was far outweighed what it wasn't. And to Naruto it was a find even greater than coming upon Sasuke's disused scroll collection, because it was basically the Ninja Academy, only the next level up. There they taught the basics of pressure points, stealth and infiltration beyond what the academy touched on, and yes, the basics of the sealing arts, which was exactly what Naruto needed for this situation. Devouring those, he was able to get a much better understanding of the sealing scrolls and exploding tags he already theoretically knew how to use, although they were presently inaccessible to him by reasons of way too uncertain chakra control, but also learned some of the hows and whys and basic rules of the art as a whole rather than its individual techniques. That gave him some of the grounding he needed to start to understand some of the higher-level stuff the Hokage and his experts talked about when they began discussing his seal. Not enough, unfortunately, but something. However, something they did have was advanced chakra control theory, and a handful of exercises for training. That was more priceless than gold to the otherwise frustrated young boy. It didn't come in the form of otherwise useful techniques like wall walking or the same for water, being more mysterious and esoteric like sitting under waterfalls and feeling your flows of energy spread out through the water, how the currents could dissipate them and carry them away, then trying to follow those threads as they vanished. For an ordinary or such an exercise would be hard. For a genin, impossible. But for Naruto, he'd never done an easier chakra drill. Why? Well, think on the scale. For an average, allowing their chakra to flow out in the currents of the river was akin to dumping in a bottle of ink, then watching the patterns it made as it got swirled away. For a typical, they might have a bucket instead of a bottle of ink to use to do the same. Naruto, to use that same analogy, was capable of dyeing the river black. He didn't want to do that, of course, as part of the point was to watch your chakra flows, learning some part of its nature as it got swirled away and dispersed in the natural flow of water, and you couldn't see any patterns if you turned the entire river into ink. Nevertheless, he was perfectly capable of creating large, easy-to-read patterns and then sustaining those all day. ANBU, as they trained to do this, performed the exercise a few times a week if they were really good and serious about their training. But not even the best did more than that, as they'd risk serious chakra exhaustion. So they learned as best they could from a few times and called it good. Naruto, who could not only turn the river black but keep it that way for hours on end, had nothing to fear about chakra exhaustion and could study that way all day every day. And he did so, for a time, gaining back loads of lost ground on his precious control, finally getting back to where he could use a few of the more tolerant and less control-oriented techniques, which brought him back the ability to use his unique transformation in all its various forms. That was a godsend, as it enabled him to do so much, besides getting rid of the hated ears and tail. Although, as he did so, he discovered something else. He'd never even tried to sustain any of his shape shifts long-term before, but that was exactly what he had to do if he was going to go all day long without sprouting fox ears or suffering other furry embarrassments. Naruto wanted to hold the technique all day, so he'd not ever need to explain the changes, but that was almost the same for him as drinking way too much water and then avoiding going to the bathroom. At first things seemed okay, then not so much, then the pressure built and built until it got released in spite of his best intentions. Suddenly sprouting foxy accoutrements during the middle of a written exam was even worse than walking in with them on. Particularly since the first few times it happened he'd had a guilty expression as they broke out, so he got to spend a few highly unpleasant sessions with the Biki, who was also the head of Konoha's ANBU interrogation unit, about the extent of his foxiness, and if the Kyuubi was breaking out, and they never believed that it wasn't. This was probably something extra chakra control could fix, but he set about pushing his mastery of the technique up a bit in hopes that could also help him prolong his tremendously useful changes. Sadly, although the catalog of the ANBU teaching materials collection had a good 5 books on chakra control, all but 2 of them were checked out, and one was an old thing in a language Naruto did not know. So, of course, he set about trying to learn it. And that was not all that Naruto was finding to do. He was drawing all over town, everything he could see, always amazed at where he could find beauty, and becoming quite skilled at portraits, landscapes, and object studies. Some things, like Hinata, he'd drawn so many times he no longer needed to even see her to put her face, in all of its various expressions, down on paper. But this was also the time that the refinements he was able to make on his blacksmithy were growing so intricate and minor that he was having trouble sustaining his interest on the subject. So, figuring that since one craft trade had been useful for a tremendous amount of diversion, he might as well try another, he took some of Kurenai's long-ago lessons on impressing females requiring a better wardrobe to heart, and began to take up tailoring. He needed new clothes, and the villagers, on the whole, did not want to sell him any, charging him outrageous prices for ordinary articles, so he figured this was the best way around their reluctance. He was thinking that, like his dingy apartment, he could turn his does not impress females' wardrobe into something far more worthy of their notice. And in a way he was lucky he'd made that choice, as it presented as much of a body of study material as blacksmithing did, so provided a great amount of relief and distraction from his ordinary ninja woes. Although not unlike metalworking, he could put some of those skills to use on creating ninja equipment for himself, and later on, his friends. Konoha had some good standard uniforms, but they were just that, standard. So long as you were making outfits yourself anyway, there was no reason not to include cargo pockets exactly where and how you wanted them, hidden pockets for things an enemy might not know to search for, and get the comfort, fit, and materials the way you like them instead of going for off-the-rack garbage. Having begun to make his own gear in other areas, Naruto had rapidly learned to prefer doing it that way, as he didn't have to settle for anything, and could make it exactly the way he wanted it every time. Then should he learn that it needed reinforcement at the knees, or whatever, He could do it rather than protest uselessly to an uncaring clerk who sold everything generically. Since having trained with Tenten, he figured he would be using a lot of scrolls after he got his abilities back, so he could include more places to carry those conveniently, and where he could more easily get at them than the standard outfit that only had room for roughly 10 or so. It was like metalworking. Everything could be made exactly how he wanted it to precisely match his own unique needs, improving how much use he could easily get out of his equipment. And like with metalworking, there were useful side additions to that skill, like how to properly embroider or make lace, that were not necessarily central to the trade, but did have a ton of things that he could learn and so add to the volume of how much he could usefully distract himself by studying. Lace patterns were like puzzles, too, in that some had fairly simple patterns with a small number of bobbins, around a dozen or so for medium complex designs, all the way up to specialized, highly complex, 200 bobbin patterns that were simply gorgeous, and breathtakingly rare, as so few had mastered the skill of how to do them, not to mention how time-consuming they were. Then there was knitting, which could be used to adapt just about any fiber into thread. So, if he wanted to hang around the Inuzuka clan kennel for a day, he could make himself a dog fur sweater while out in the forest. That was another good aspect to sewing, it was portable. When he made things out of metal, he needed a forge with loads of tools to do it in, but he could sew practically anything with tools he could hold in his lap. So he could pursue his knitting even while out in the forest of death. Embroidery was like drawing, in that just about any pattern could be created. And that made it flexible, too. Unlike drawing, it had special techniques you had to master in order to be able to do this instead of that, but those merely presented a new body of material to learn, and thus a distraction from his misery at having pathetic ninja skills. Although, he was no longer trailing nearly so badly behind in that department anymore. Having access to his own unique shape-shift technique had enabled him to go through the route of relearning his martial arts. So, while he was once more hitting that same upper limit again soon, at least he had the skills of a top rookie genin instead of a dead last. That was comforting. Not super, but comforting. And this time he had a wee bit more utility out of it, as his strength and speed were superior to before. Not enough to beat Kiba's superior, he tried, and failed, to do so many times, but that this doesn't suck so much as it did anymore superior. He still lagged way behind the actual martial arts specialists, but he could do more damage than someone with only average body conditioning. That was helpful, as previously he wasn't dead last, as there were still people like Sakura out in the ninja world, but he had sucked pretty badly. And by sneaking any old scroll out of Sasuke's apartment, he could do the whole thing with meeting and training alongside Tenten too. That quickly brought up his throwing weapon skills once again, despite his longer reach and changed body having thrown him off before. So, having two departments in which he was no longer quite so sucky made him feel much less of a low-grade academy student, and at least more of a competent genin once more. Not that he felt he'd been, but still better than before. Anyway, having access to his ability to shape-shift again gave him options that he didn't have recently, like the ability to follow through on some of the plans he'd made for the Great Girl Decode. Still, it wasn't like that went fast, as even once he'd steered one of those conversations onto Sasuke, the fangirls would squeal, "Oh, he lost his family. He's been through so much suffering. He must be so tender." In a moment of carelessness, sexy Naruto blurted out, "BH. He wouldn't know tenderness if it bashed him upside the head." All of the other girls glared at him. Okay, more tact was called for. Very early on, Naruto had tried, not long after Ebisu had told him about how unique and strong his transformation technique was, approaching Kakashi as his favored student and demanding training. Sasuke never asked. But all the lazy would do would be to agree, and then say, "Use your Sharingan to copy this." Which pretty much sucked, because without the Sharingan all Naruto could do was memorize the hand seals, and that wasn't half of knowing how to actually perform it. He'd need more data than that to even invent his own form of it. That was the reason why he didn't already have every ninja technique in Konoha, or at least 1,000 or so Kakashi had copied. However, now he was able to wear his sullen teammates' face once more. The trickster of Konoha had another idea in that regard that just might work. So, he approached Kakashi while both looking and acting like the Uchiha and grumbled, "Teach me seals." Kakashi looked at him a moment, then nodded and took him off to a teacher on that subject, one of the ANBU who'd first taught him. Naruto wasn't able to hold up the shapeshift for very long, but even so the fragmentary lessons he began to pick up that way made a big difference in his understanding of that art. And to his most happy delight, it turned out to be one where chakra control was almost meaningless. Okay, the art required a great deal of precision and control to get it right, but those were demanded as part of the scribing down of the seals, choosing the correct ones, and selecting the right diagram for your purpose. The actual activation required only a surge of chakra, no more complicated in most cases than activating an explosive tag, which was something Naruto could do. No, once he'd learned that much, he was immediately back to using storage scrolls and explosive tags again, as he hadn't previously dared, not wanting to mess up space-time any more than it already was, or potentially destroy Konoha with an overpowered tag. Now that he didn't have that worry, he could use them again, and more. This looked like an art he could have a great deal of fun with. So, he began to learn it at an increased pace, pressing for more time with those seal teachers by really cranking down hard on the impulse to revert to his true face and recent foxy form. He began to experiment on his own in ways on how he might make it easier to sustain. Oi! Ino! Shikamaru! Wait up! What do you want? The team whose members he named turned around to face the boy, with Ino putting a hand on her hip to confront him and act as spokesperson. You've heard the news of the Sand and Sound teams, right? Naruto didn't pause for confirmation, only stopping before them to take out a scroll and unseal a pair of tidy stacks of equipment. Holding one of something up to Ino, he told her, "Here, you're going to need this." Armor? She gaped at it disbelievingly, then shook her head. Sorry, Naruto, but it's not my style. I'm not a close combat type. Exactly. He shot her a huge grin. That's exactly my point. You're not a close combat type. But we're ninjas, right? So, the whole point is deception, right? So, if you show up to our forest test today decked out in combat armor and with a couple of swords strapped on your back, people are going to think you are a combat type, right? Shikamaru blinked a couple of times, processing this idea. Grudgingly, he gave it approval. By dressing this way, ninja from other villages are going to think our greatest weakness is our strength. So instead of attacking us directly in head-on fights, where Ino and I are at our worst, they will try other options. This could give us a much better chance at passing this test. Naruto continued to grin widely. Not just other villages. We are the youngest group of genins taking the test, and none of the older students know much about us. Mostly they don't care about younger kids enough to learn about our abilities. Here, put that on. He tossed a bundle of clothes to Choji, who unfolded the top item to find a robe patterned in an elaborate flame style. There are matching shirts and pants to go with it, Naruto told him. Shikamaru was thinking, rubbing his chin. So Ino and I dress up as close combat experts, while Choji, who is our combat expert, dresses up as a fire technique specialist who is boasting about his abilities and his art. That way, if we are attacked, most ninja would avoid Ino and me, while rushing in to hit Choji, believing that he would be our weak point. What did you think of this? The entire team blinked at Naruto, who shrugged and grinned. Like I said, the entire point of being a ninja is deception. You know I don't have any close friends. What did you think I did with all of my time? I spent it studying to learn how to do things. I just played the fool because I didn't care to give away my abilities. But now that it's a matter of life or death for us, I figured I could show you a few things to your advantage. And with this stuff, even if it doesn't fool anyone, there is still a much reduced chance of a stray kunai or saman taking you out. Shikamaru was nodding. It was a very sensible strategy. I would like to play a game of shogi with you later. Naruto's grin widened. I look forward to it. Then he stood up. Here, let me help you guys put this gear on. Some of the joints and fasteners are a wee bit tricky. I've never worn anything like this before, Ino confessed. Don't worry. You'll find that it fits you like a glove. Here, you slip into the undersuit, and after you have that on, I'll show you how to don the rest of it. After I show you, I'll also leave you with a set of instructions for putting it on and taking it off so you don't have trouble camping tonight. Meanwhile, not far away, another group of Konoha genin was being stopped by another clone of Naruto. Oi! Shino! Hinata-chan! Wait up! Gaara, wait! Naruto calmly walked into the threat zone and held up a hand, so non-threatening and unafraid that the demon container from Sand paused in the act, just before crushing Sasuke to death. Naruto turned to face Sakura, who was trembling. Sakura, Sasuke is in the grasp of Gaara's sand, which is unescapable and can crush stones. Only you can save him now. Giving a disbelieving glance to her blonde teammate, the pink-haired girl nonetheless sucked in her lower lip and nervously drew a kunai, looking over to the implacable face of the boy from sand. Naruto rolled his eyes and swatted the kunai out of her hands. Not like that, he scolded her. You can't beat him in a fight, don't even try. In fact, Gaara, would you mind if I threw a kunai at your shoulder, just to show her? Taking the hostile, flat, unfriendly stare as a yes, Naruto drew his own and tossed it gently and underhand toward the demon of sand. The expected shield stopped it cold, and Naruto nodded. You see? His defenses are automatic, and nearly invulnerable. If you approached him with hostile intent, he could grind you into a thin red paste without really trying. Gaara, would you mind bending that to ruin, just to show her you can? In seconds, without Gaara even having to move a muscle, the sands had twisted the kunai into an unrecognizable mass of metal. Sakura's eyes were wide and she was trembling in fear, realizing now the extent of their danger, or some of it at any rate. As I said, Sasuke is already dead, unless you save him, Naruto told his female teammate, playing on an idea that Temari had given him earlier, just to see if it worked. But how? The kunoichi objected. I can't fight that guy. I never thought you could, Naruto returned. I don't expect you to try. No, you are going to save Sasuke's life by paying for it in a way that Gaara may willingly take in return for letting him go. She looked fearfully between him and the demon from sand, nervously touching her chin with one hand. But I don't have any money on me. The blonde boy shook his head. No, and I wouldn't expect him to take it, even if you did. Then what? She demanded, getting upset at all these riddles. Demon containers need their lovin', he told her in direct, no-nonsense tones, acting on the suspicion that people often do for others what they most want to get themselves. Gaara's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, and the sand he'd been sending out to grasp those two paused in its forward creep. Think of it this way, only your love can save Sasuke now. But to save him you have to give up on him, and give that love to Gaara instead. I imagine that can be a temporary thing, but don't expect more than you pay for. If you give the boy a nervous peck on one cheek, I imagine he might let Sasuke go after having only pulverized his legs and arms into useless, mangled flesh, pulled out his eyes and crushed his balls into liquid, a maimed and useless cripple but not dead. A serious kiss on the lips might save Sasuke's legs. A complete makeout session with hugs might be worth those plus his arms, while I imagine that if you really impress Gaara, you might actually be able to get Sasuke free unharmed. Don't hold back though, if that is your aim. The best a half-hearted effort is going to get you is a blind future member of a soprano boys' choir. Sakura stared at her teammate in shock, before nervously licking her lips and looking towards Gaara. She hesitatingly took a step forward, then turned back to Naruto, objecting, but it's my first kiss. Naruto sighed, shrugged, rolled his eyes and spread his hands. Okay, look, I know those are valuable, but let me put it this way, would you trade that in return for Sasuke's life? Thinking about it for only a second, Sakura nodded. Naruto put his arms behind his head but regarded her kindly. If it helps, close your eyes and imagine it as Sasuke. Picturing it as someone I like helps me sometimes get over the initial awkwardness. When did you ever kiss? Sakura shot back at him. Naruto rather pointedly did not answer, just pointing a finger towards Gaara, as if to say she had other business she'd best be considering now. At first sighing, then stiffening her resolve, Sakura nodded and marched off to do her duty for Sasuke and her village by smooching the enemy. Yes, if those infiltration agents could bear to do it, so could she. Seeing Sakura approach him, Gaara turned to his sister, glaring at her. Temari. Right. She rolled her eyes, careful he couldn't see it, and went over on her own to make out with the demon container for Konoha. As she thought of how good a kisser he was, though, the duty suddenly seemed much less terrible, and she licked her lips in anticipation. Both teams got directly to the tower without serious interruption. Gaara was more than capable of getting scrolls for each of them, and wasn't about to give up on Sakura's company, fumbling and hesitant though her makeout was. She never did put any heat into her kisses though, so the Sasuke she got back as they entered the tower doors was due for a change of career to that blind boys' choir Naruto had mentioned. Sakura spent the rest of that week nurturing the grieving, maimed Uchiha, and Naruto spent it practicing his chakra control and hanging out with the Sand siblings, who, as he'd known before, were surprisingly good company. Then the prelim match put him up against Gaara, and he had to bow out, as there was just no way he could beat him without access to more techniques than his presently miserable chakra control allowed him. And getting crushed like a grape was a miserable way to end a day. Naruto made an interesting discovery during his ongoing stealth and scout training by breaking into a shop that had sold him those miserable weapons. The owner kept a second account book hidden away, one gloating over how much he had overcharged Naruto on his purchases, on how many instances. It read like a high school teacher's diary on how many of his students he'd molested. The guy knew he was doing wrong but had no intention of stopping as he was having way too much fun, although in this case it was hatred the man was fulfilling, not lust. It was something of an eye-opener to the young lad, but, on reflection, not really unexpected. He'd known from what he'd observed before that the overcharging on poor-quality equipment could not be accidental. To find the account book only confirmed that. Only it did surprise the young lad just by how much he'd been cheated. No wonder the orphan's allowance, generous for most, had barely kept him in cup ramen. If the other stores had been doing price gouging like this. But then he thought back to those shopping trips with Ino, and learning to judge good deals and quality products. Yes, not only had the other stores been doing it, some of them had been much worse than this weapons dealer. He hadn't thought to connect those to his life before, but it was true. He could expect to pay several times what Ino did and they not give him goods a fraction of the quality she seemed to regard as normal. Apparently, they not only got to hurt the demon brat by gouging him, they made a surprising amount of money at it. So while other kids bought candy or toys, good clothes, ate well and amused themselves, Naruto had always been scraping the edge of poverty, living with next to nothing. That sounded like something that needed reversing. Before, Naruto had been able to afford to renovate his apartment to palace-like levels using clone labor and borrowed money, getting high-rate loans he never had to pay back as the resets always wiped them clean. Now, well, he'd been robbed. It seemed only fair to return that favor. A thin metal shim slid in under the window and unlocked the latch. Then the ninja outside slipped in and eased the window back into its frame behind him. Wearing a mask, yet ears twitching and tail swishing behind him, the boy danced carefully down the steps from the upper-story balcony he'd gotten to on ninja wires, always keeping a careful eye out for A&BU wandering the rooftops, and slunk into the slumbering house in the dark of night. It made for an interesting exercise, finding out where and how those shops stored their money, breaking into those places and removing only enough to cover what they'd first stolen from him. It involved a whole new set of skills to do it, too, as previously he'd had no need of safe-cracking or some of those other advanced burglary techniques. Still, it was interesting, so he began to pursue it more. This particular home was that of a grocer, a man who'd been too clever by half to have kept any incriminating records on how he'd committed robbery of a small orphan boy. Few of the merchants of Konoha had been so reckless. However, it had been possible to reconstruct much of the story anyway. All Naruto had to do was learn a little basic accounting. He knew what shops he'd frequented, for how long, and what he'd gotten there, even for what prices. After that, it was just a minor exercise in math. And by now he'd gotten good at math. Counting the value of expired food as 0, then calculating all of his food budget spent at this guy's store, the guy owed him a significant amount of money. At interest, because they always do on any debt owed to them, at the rates they'd have charged him, and that chunk of dough became almost painful. Previously, Naruto had been the only one to be hurt from this guy's theft. Now that was going to get reversed. If only for one day. One of Naruto's water element techniques was the sticky capture field, which covered a medium to large area in a transparent, hard-to-detect, glue-like substance useful for restricting the movements of other ninja. Of course it was of limited utility against Orochimaru, but even then it did slow him down a touch and make him slightly easier to hit. However, the sticky glue stuff was not what Naruto was thinking of right then. No, it was the other half of that technique, because a ninja could be trapped just as easily in his own sticky capture field as anyone else, so to prevent that they focused chakra to their feet, hovering above it so they could move without hindrance. This is what enabled them to attack those trapped inside of the field and what made it a useful combat technique instead of a mere delay or distraction. But Naruto had never before mastered that part. It had seemed a waste when he could always pelt the trapped ninja with a barrage of thrown weapons. Only now he was causing himself to re-examine that position. According to the one chakra book that he had from that ANBU library that he could presently read, direct chakra manipulation in all of its forms was a key and source for good chakra control, and the more exercises one could perform, and the more perfectly they could be pulled off, the better. The book was thick on theory and very hard to read, making assumptions of the student's understanding and using very technical language, but it was, despite being thick as coal tar in some cases, being helpful to the boy, who could use all of the chakra control techniques ever developed and then some. So, seeing as how Naruto knew the theory on how to perform the levitate my feet on pads of chakra so I don't quite touch the surface I'm walking on part of the sticky capture field, and that was a pure chakra exercise, there was no reason for him to believe that it would be any less valuable for his control than the other 3 chakra exercises he'd already mastered, and which did not seem to be doing him much good just now. So obviously he put that theory to the test, and got rewarded immediately by a small surge of improved control as he mastered that exercise, putting him back to the level he'd been at when he'd graduated the Ninja Academy, which was still pathetic, but nowhere near as crippled as he'd been, as it restored to him most of his basic techniques. He dared not try a medical jutsu for fear of killing someone, and his illusions he'd learned since the academy sucked, too hazy and warped for anyone to believe. Also, his elemental techniques were beyond his grasp, wanting to fly out of control and do things sometimes opposite of what he'd intended. But even with all that out of his reach, he still had Body's switch and his unique form of transformation, which brought with it sexy and harem. Plus, he could body flicker, and his transformation no longer hurt so hard when he sustained it for very long. So he was getting back to genin level on his techniques. That was when he discovered, during his ongoing study of the sealing arts, while disguised as Sasuke, a trick that his improved control and duration of transformations made far more profitable, about the existence of chakra limiters, put on prisoners so enemy ninja could not escape via techniques. The most common ones seemed to be the simplest, a set of seals that could be built into a device and combined with a ninja's manacles that simply drained out their chakra. And well, when Naruto tried a set of those out on himself, he simply burnt them out. They were never designed with anywhere near the capacity it would take to drain him significantly. They just didn't have the power. On the other hand, an older, more obsolete design could help him. They were more complex than the simple drain ones, and slightly less effective on most ninja, so nobody ever used them anymore. But for Naruto's needs they were close to ideal. These chakra limiters tried to prevent access to one's chakra, although they were not perfect, so prisoners with access to low-power techniques could still bypass and escape them. Even highly refined mid-level techniques could be snuck past the reduced chakra flow, so those limiters had not been very successful in restraining prisoners. For Naruto they were perfect, or nearly so. From his study of the sealing arts he discovered how to adapt and play with the design until he could create a version that limited the flow on his own chakra enough to be able to use his higher level techniques safely once again, but there was a snag: it could only work during peaceful conditions. The chakra surge of him getting emotional, or his adrenaline pumping would burn them out, and he'd lose his precious control once again. So he could use his fighting techniques only so long as he wasn't fighting. It was a setback, but not a critical one, as despite the loss he still wasn't any worse off than he was before creating the limiters, as far as combat was concerned. No, what they really did for him was optimize training opportunities. Now, so long as he was wearing his limiters, his chakra control was back to where he could go ask for training from Ebisu and get that scroll again, which put him back in touch with Tenten more often, although really he could get that much more easily by breaking into Sasuke's place to steal those scrolls all over again, just without messing up the place this time. But he could be playing with those affinity developing techniques again, so our hero was back on track to mastering that scroll's materials and getting Ebisu to teach him something else, perhaps something more useful. Although, he did have to admit, being able to use all of those things that having elemental affinities gave him was far from useless. Also, Ebisu was far from the only teacher in town. Naruto stood before Anko, grinning brightly. Then she smirked. "Okay, kid, you've got my interest. Tell me what you know already. We'll see where we go from there." He began to list them off. "My basic 3 are fully mastered, seal-less and almost traceless. Body flicker likewise. I also know some camping ones. One for lighting fires, another to read by, A lightning one for charging batteries and a fire one for warming yourself in cold weather. Do you know them all? She interrupted, then smiled when he nodded. Okay, just call them the traveling 10. We all do. Anko instructed him with a careless shrug. They're a bit dated, not everyone knows them anymore, but it used to be no genin would leave the town gates without some. I don't know why they don't teach them as much anymore, they're all still just as useful as they've always been. I can't think of how you'd be expected to go on any long-range survival-type missions without them. I'll admit, part of this stage of the test is to weed out those who don't know them. It's a bit unusual for anyone below joining to know all 10. Most genin just learn the 2 easiest for them, like lightning ones for creating light to read by and charging batteries. The way most teams are set up, that gives most of them 6 out of the 10, without counting the instructor, and as we go they'll most pick up a few others for convenience. So, what elemental affinity have you got? Naruto blinked at her guilelessly. All of them, he pronounced simply. I did the leaf thing for each of them, drying, burning, crinkling and so on. And then when I moved on to the traveling 10 it got real easy. It had taken him a couple of weeks to get the basic affinity for each element developed, which he didn't think was too big a deal, having no idea what a spectacular rate of progress that was. It was nice to have that back. Anko's jaw had dropped open, then she reformed herself into a very happy girl. Oh yes! This kid was going to help her beat her old teacher senseless. It was almost too much to hope for, but she still asked, anything else? Why yes, he grinned fairly. I can use earth-style wall, earth flow river, underground move, inner decapitation, mud overturn, and that stone lodging destruction that allows you to control earth and stone, only I find it more useful to shape the stuff to suit my needs rather than just causing rocks to fall on people. I have other ways of causing avalanches. The special perked up. That was an interesting list. But Naruto wasn't finished. Then my fire techniques are Fireball and Grand Fireball, Dragon Flame Projection, which I think it's a bit stupid to have 3 techniques that do nothing but let you breathe fire. At least they could have more variation, like that Phoenix Flower thing that lets you breathe out lots of smaller balls of flame, even hide shuriken and stuff in them. But I also know that technique, the Phoenix Flower one, I mean. Before he'd even finished she'd begun to goggle. That many? How did you even fail this test? I'd have thought it would have been too easy for you. With techniques like yours, you would have been unstoppable compared to most of the teams in there. And I was too. But our teamwork stunk. The boy gave a shrug. I tried, but couldn't stop my partners from racing off alone to face opponents they couldn't handle. They didn't want my help, overestimating their own abilities drastically. I tried to follow and offer help anyway, but I wasn't able to get to them in time, and they died, so my team failed. Anko was nodding. That was not unusual, and the reason they had tests such as this one, to weed out the pampered students who didn't have any real idea what they were getting into, or to at least wake them up so they'd take their responsibilities seriously. But the young boy took her nod as a signal to go on continuing his incomplete listing of his known techniques. Then I've also got the Mist Waltz, where you exhale a cloud of flammable gas over a wide area that explodes on contact with flame. Only I've modified mine so that it looks like a simple misty shroud, used for fogging areas to grant concealment, that I also know, but I'm listing them out of order. Anko's eyes were shining. Adaptation of a well-known technique to disguise it as another? Especially an offensive one to make it look defensive? Gold. This kid was pure gold. Yet, he was still continuing. I used the waltz recently in conjunction with my last fire technique, the dragon web, the one that allows you to send out a burst of flame that travels along wires. I'd set up a trap where I sent fire along all of the tripwires and warning lines I'd spread around our campsite, after I'd first filled the area with flammable gas. Orochimaru's former student began to cry tears of joy. Here he was. The perfect student. Not only had he a vast technique arsenal for his age, but he used them imaginatively and combined them well. Oh, the things they could do together. But what she hadn't realized was he'd been listing them off alphabetically by element, and he was only just getting started with lightning. Then I've got the thunder punch technique for charging fists or weapons with electricity, and actually I do that with my feet, knees and elbow strikes too. I've just recently gotten lightning whips down, and my thunder lance is coming along nicely. I almost hit someone with it. Then I've got the celestial web, same thing as the dragon web, only using lightning instead of fire. I'm working on another jutsu right now that should coat me in armor of lightning, which would be cool. Impulsively, Anko grabbed the kid's head and mashed his face into her bosom. She had a son. Boyfriend. Brother. Whatever you wanted to call it. Whatever he wanted to be. Train him? Heck. She'd gladly marry him. If this kid was this strong at 12 years old, just think of what he'd be at 15, or 20. Her old teacher was doomed. Did you hear her? Doomed. The special broke out in mad, triumphal cackling, still crushing the kid's face into her underclad bosom, and giving him an eyeful in the bargain, and probably his first ever close encounter of the memory kind, as the kid had been bottle-fed as a youth. Oh, boy, we are going to defeat Rochi-chan and make his life hell. Come here and give me a hug. She gave a long, joyful cackle. Still holding the kid's head to her chest, she whispered gleefully in his ear, "Tell me, how do you like to know the temporary paralysis technique?" A grin spread over Naruto's features and he returned the hug. "Love to. Let's get started." "Good," she responded with equal vigor. "Because when we go after the old bastard, he's going to use a lot of snakes, he always does, and there's a few things you ought to know that will help defeat them, like snakes are very vulnerable to illusions, generally, and that even extends to things like the temporary paralysis technique." "Couldn't we just kill them?" he asked in wonder. "If we did, he'd just summon more. Better to incapacitate them, that way he's got a more difficult time replacing them." "Teach me, oh mistress!" he cried out in wonder, and Anko smiled fondly as she rubbed the hair on his head. The thing about his fights at the preliminaries so far was that Naruto was facing people he could not yet beat. He'd only picked up 2 patterns for reaching those tests. One had him facing Gaara, which was suicide, and the other put him up against Kiba, who deserved the grade. Yeah, Naruto's martial arts were pretty good for a rookie genin, but there were many veteran genin with commensurate skills out there who surpassed him, while Kiba's fighting ability was solidly, as well as mixed in well with appropriate supporting ninjutsu techniques. Since Naruto's new limiters only worked outside of combat, that left him with very few options for trying to get through the preliminaries. Either he'd bow out facing Gaara, get defeated by facing Kiba with a small number of shadow clones, or pack the room so tightly with clones that he couldn't maneuver and Kiba and his dog would just drill through them all. No, after having faced him a few times, Naruto became convinced that Kiba really ought to pass on to the final stage of the test, because that guy fought in such a way that Konoha needed him as a. The problem then became how to do it? Because so far Naruto needed to beat him in order to pass, and that was looking difficult enough on its own. Then he had a bright idea. Those preliminaries got fought between those teams that passed the trial of the forest. The answer, then, seemed to be to control who got scrolls and actually got out of the forest. The Sound team, for example, did not need to get through. They met them early on during those Orochimaru days, and if Naruto could kill one, then that team could not go on to qualify no matter how many scrolls they claimed. And that would change the preliminary matchups, mixing them up and altering who he was sent up against. That way, perhaps both Kiba and him could pass to go on to become. Come to think of it, Naruto's team also ran into that team from Rain more than once. There was that scout that ran into them practically right out of the gate when they entered the forest, then they'd had to beat them again once they started being led by Kabuto to the tower. So, take out the scout early and see what happened. After beating the tar out of that guy and throwing him outside of the testing grounds so he, and therefore his team, would be automatically disqualified, Naruto began to take apart the guy's breath mask. It was an interesting design. Probably the most fascinating part was how they'd gotten the flow rates high enough so that the air passage did not feel constricted in spite of heavy exercise like combat. And although he couldn't copy it yet, Naruto didn't feel any part of it was beyond him. It also began to give him ideas. Should he, for example, work this into the helmets of the armor he was making for himself and certain select other Konoha ninja, they then could do things like pass harmlessly through areas of poison gas or other subtle destructive techniques. In fact, if they could learn to use those themselves, that could be an added advantage. Any technique you could use on the area you stood in, and not be harmed by, gave you a great advantage against most of the close combat fighters. So it was probably a good idea to go ahead and do this. Smiling brightly, Naruto put away the mask, already resolving to research those parts he couldn't immediately identify so that he could later make his own copies, perhaps even improve on it. So long as he was fiddling with the helmet, maybe he could also add a rangefinder. He'd seen some of the other ninja using those. It would be worth the research to find out. Maybe even add a radio. "What are you doing?" Sakura asked of her blonde teammate, currently sitting in a pile of garbage where they were supposed to be meeting up for the Forest of Death in a few minutes. "I'm putting on my armor," he told her quite calmly, attaching certain plates in order to his body. Sakura was taken aback. Stunned, she whispered, "I didn't know you had armor." Naruto sighed. This conversation was the reason why he hadn't worn it to this test before. The frank disbelief Sakura, as well as Sasuke, had when he displayed any useful equipment or ability stung him every time. So it was in tired, long-suffering tones that he answered her. "Face it, Harino. You don't know much of anything about me. You know only my academy grades, that I wear orange, and I used to ask you out. That's it. You've never wanted to know any more." Trying to pretend that he wasn't right, and that facing this truth didn't hurt, she blurted out, "Why didn't you wear it before?" He snorted. "For D-rank missions? Oh, it would be so useful for painting fences. For that matter, why don't I crawl around a bit while chasing a cat? I'm sure the extra noise wouldn't warn it off. And as far as that mission to wave, well, it wasn't ready. I'd been so certain we were going to be stuck in more D-rank missions for a time that I'd taken it apart to redo the joints. So I didn't have it on the one mission I could have really used." Sakura stood there for several moments, blinking and quite confused. Then Sasuke came up, and her crush snorted. "Layering yourself in tinfoil isn't going to save you, dope." No, Naruto stood up, helmet under one arm, the rest of his armor already on. "But pulling that stick out of your ass might help your attitude." The Uchiha glared hard in return, while Naruto sported an impudent grin as he lifted his helmet to put it on. Annoyed by what he perceived as the dope's arrogance, the Uchiha threw a right hook to take that smile off his face. Naruto blocked that with a kunai, tearing open a long gash in Sasuke's arm. Almost a stranger to pain, no one had ever dared to hit him before. Sasuke went down howling as he clutched his wounded arm. Bawling like a big baby, Sasuke got their group thrown out of the test. Naruto sighed and rolled his eyes. He was about to turn away to go do some more practice when he saw Kakashi standing there, looking almost angry enough to try and kill him again. "What?" he snapped at his titular teacher before they could get started. "We're ninja. That bastard should know better than to initiate a combat situation unless he wants actual combat." Kakashi began charging up 1,000 birds technique. Speaking quietly, he said, "Ninja who do not care for their teammates are less than trash. And teachers who do not teach are worse than that." Naruto shouted back before storming off, not even bothering to acknowledge Kakashi's build-up to attack. They let his assassination technique peter out. The attempt to bluff had failed. He was sure he could have gotten a greater reaction than that. The boy had seen him use that killing technique before, why hadn't it intimidated him? He sighed, making a note to throw Naruto off the team. If he was going to be like this, he wouldn't be useful for Sasuke's progress anymore. Sasuke's face was useful for many things: playing darts, molding mud patties, practicing basic medical techniques that you wouldn't want to get wrong on someplace important, and not the least of which was breaking up Naruto's boredom by pretending to be him to go off and learn things. But that was not all that the Uchiha's appearance could be used for. No, there were seemingly limitless uses for the bastard's fame and glory. Like, for example, improving Naruto's medical knowledge. Now you might ask, how could that be? Perfect chakra control was required to be a medical ninja, correct? And you'd be right to wonder. But, going up as Sasuke on a lark to the hospital to ask, he found many willing instructors who taught him less precise, less powerful medical techniques than Kabuto and his dad had shown him, but that could be mastered by those with significantly less than perfect control. After all, people with perfect control were rather rare, and didn't always choose medicine as their specialty, and, as a ninja village, they needed more medical professionals than that. However, not every injury or bruise was so bad that it needed the very best of care. So ergo, there were less powerful special powers taught to those who had less control, and thus, by filling up some of their needed medical professional numbers with those who had only moderate ability, they could free up the time and energy of the truly gifted for the more serious cases. Funny how Kabuto had never thought to mention that. But not every nurse or midwife had to have absolute perfect chakra control. Some had only slightly better than average, while others had good. Naruto, while he was wearing his seals, fell between those for the moment. Learning to be one of those moderately skilled professionals for now, until he had the control to be a gifted one, also had other benefits in that he got to play pranks on Sasuke's fangirls and blow off some steam at the Uchiha at the same time. You wanted to see me, Sasuke? Sakura appeared at the door to the Uchiha's apartment bearing a sprig of flowers and a guest gift, unaware that the real Uchiha was off training on the other side of the village, and would be absent all day. Naruto Sasuke nodded, stepping back brutally from the portal to allow her in. Sakura entered with ill-concealed delight, putting her flowers into a vase and her gift on a corner of his table. Seeing a book open on the table, she picked it up and flipped it around to read its cover. Oh. Are you studying medicine, Sasuke-kun? Naruto Sasuke grunted. How marvelous! Sakura skipped into the air in glee, before she brightly bent over with eyes alight and shining, her hands clasped behind her to ask, expecting to be denied, is there any way I can help? Naruto Sasuke nodded grumpily. Take off your clothes. Her eyes went round and a sudden blush covered her face. He turned to gaze sulkily out the window, as the real Sasuke might have done, and grunted, page 93. Obediently flipping through the textbook to the page indicated, and stealing nervous glances at him all the time, Sakura saw the steps outlined for how to perform a proper medical exam, and a suggested homework assignment at the conclusion of that chapter saying there was no substitute for doing one on a live patient, and recommended performing several on different subjects. Biting her lip, she understood what he meant. Considering that for a moment, she shyly shrugged and answered, all right, Sasuke, if that's what you want I'll be glad to help. Turning back around to face her, Naruto Sasuke nodded grimly, and she began, very timidly and shyly, to unbutton the top buttons on her dress. You wanted to see me, Sasuke? Ino appeared at the door to the Uchiha's apartment bearing a sprig of flowers and a guest gift. Only 28 more fangirls to go. A large part of Naruto felt guilty, but he really needed the experience, as there truly was no substitute for having actually done the exams. He'd read as much as he could until reading didn't improve his skills anymore. He needed warm bodies to study if he was going to learn more, and Naruto wasn't a part of the official Konoha medical establishment to tap into how they'd arranged to do this. He'd chosen Sasuke's fangirls because this was technically an injury to them, invading their privacy and so on, but they were also technically followers of his enemy the Uchiha, and so open to injury by the rules of war. A part of him wanted to turn this into a prank, so that by dropping specific, detailed references to how the girls looked naked he could be embarrassing them forever. However, a large part of him was too embarrassed to, wanting to learn what he had to learn and then never mention this again, to anyone, regardless of the reset. But both sides had to agree he got some very valuable help on his medical training out of this bit of trickery, pushing him past the threshold from pure academic know-how to usable expertise that was a vital part of making an actual medic out of him, a path on which he could save lives. Hinata, Anko, and, surprisingly, both Tenten and Temari would aid his studies without the need for deception. Naruto felt ugly and soiled over having deceived those girls. He told himself it was all for a good cause, until he realized that was probably what Jiraiya told himself about gathering research for his smutty books. So he resolved to do something to make it up to them, even if they never knew that he'd done that to them in the first place. Starting from that vague idea, he went off to his next sewing lesson, only to connect the two. Girls were always complaining about not having enough outfits. He was good at making clothes by then, so he could make at least a partial restitution by making them some good clothing. Most of Sasuke's fan club were not kunoichi, as most of those that tried had failed their genin tests. So the typical combat where he was working on would not suit them. So, acting on his spy training, he first found out what clothes they wanted, then began to work on that. Still, it didn't seem enough to give them copies of outfits they already could have bought, so using that as his starting point he began to design new stuff. Naruto played around and experimented with the fashions until he had such a discerning eye for color, cut, and style that people could easily question his masculinity. But he didn't stop until he could get each of those girls he'd wronged squealing with delight as they opened his anonymous packages. But he didn't stop there. He gave them whole collections of outfits, not just uniforms even for the kunoichi. They got everything from the skin up: socks, panties, brasiers, blouses, tops, skirts, and various accessories. Summer dresses, day wear, evening wear, practical outfits, workout clothes, swimwear, and formal wear all got included. He learned to make hats, shoes, and purses to go with them, adding on ornamental pins with his metalworking skills, along with rings, bells, buckles, brooches, and other jewelry. As an unintended side effect, by the time he was no more than halfway done, he was far more intimately acquainted with those girls' bodies than even the medical exams had done for him, as a tremendous number of fittings and so on had been required to get even a fraction as close as he'd wanted to. Almost amusingly, at the point where he'd felt he needed fittings, they were not very hard to get. All he had to do was show them some of the outfits he had already prepared and wave a tape measure, and he could get any one of them gleefully shedding her clothes in order to be properly fitted for new ones. To most girls, there are special exceptions to the modesty rules, and both doctors and really good tailors fall among them. But it wasn't entirely without its awkward moments. "Why are you doing this, Naruto?" Sakura had asked him, as he was tugging on the fabric covering her panty-clad bottom, nose mere inches away as he checked that pair for a proper fit. It had to smoothly follow the line of her thigh just so, before it could be perfect. "It's a wonderful outfit," but she looked at the gorgeous dress on the rack before her, and the team of clones making stitches behind it, producing the next dress. There were stars in her eyes over the outfits she was getting. He showed a preference for ribbons and lace when he could get away with using them, and those laces were simply unbelievable. She'd never heard of some of those patterns before. The village shops didn't carry anything half so gorgeous. Then the embroidery was so delicate and lovely, half of it you didn't even know it was there until the light caught it just a certain way, and then the patterns were exquisite. Hinata had an outfit that made you think butterflies were constantly flitting all over it, as the light caught them appearing and vanishing again and again. The village shops didn't sell any embroidered clothes, claiming there was no market willing to pay prices worth the labor. But all of the girls she knew would simply die for a good piece of it, and this was better than most of them had ever dared to dream of. Even the fabrics were to die for. In fact, she could see some clones in the back making them from scratch. Who would have thought he was so versatile? Still, she was also worried and concerned over Naruto's behavior. When he'd first asked, she was sure this had somehow been a ruse to get her on a date, but that had all been blown away when she'd seen how good a tailor he was. Now she had to know why. Naruto, perceiving this, made a chalk mark on the pair she was wearing about a minor alteration that could be made to improve them, before answering, "Really? I want to be a medic, but the Konoha hospital won't train me. So I've got to get first-hand knowledge of bodies another way. I didn't want to rob the morgue or peep on bathhouses, so I figured I'd take up tailoring." Oh. She wondered about that, not knowing if he was joking or not. Incidentally, after giving a few outfits away to Sasuke's fangirls, he'd felt guilty not preparing wardrobes for those girls who'd liked him enough to help him without any deception, so he'd also prepared clothes for Hinata and the others as well, with the interesting side effect that, after having woken up Hinata with a gift of clothes, she'd gone out wearing them, and Kurenai had met them after the test, and liked them so much that he'd finally gotten a tape measure on the woman. In fact, she'd insisted, taking him aside and demanding that she be allowed to take off her clothes to be measured by him as part of his hopes for a future relationship with Hinata, since she was her teacher. Then the grocer's wife had tried to demand the same thing, promising him a discount on all future purchases if she could get an outfit from him. It boggled Naruto's mind how much clothes mattered to women. One interesting observation was that while he might be hated by the village in general, even the women who'd always despised him loved his outfits, and he got requests for fittings from women who'd practically spit on him before. It was odd how things worked that way. But no, Naruto had no interest in fitting any of them, sticking to those he felt he owed, designing ever larger and ever better wardrobes for the sleek, petite, athletic A, B, and maybe C-cup girls he knew, no matter how many others clamored for the tailor's attention. And Hinata-chan just looked stunning in that off-the-shoulder ball gown he made for her, too. You really know how to pamper a girl," Ino purred as she was being fitted for a new swimsuit, feeling very fond of the care he was taking over every tiny detail. "Too bad you don't also do a girl's hair. If you could also do a facial and manicure, that would be perfect." "Oh?" Naruto looked up from where he'd been getting the fabric to settle on her breasts just so, to where it lifted and enhanced without seeming to, while remaining comfortable to wear. getting the colors right on her swimwear so it showed her off to best effect, both wet and dry, and remain modest when wet, had been a challenge. It's not that her colors were hard, blondes were easy to dress as far as colors went, seeing as so many suited them. Hinata-chan had been a far greater challenge to pick colors for. No, the problem had been that most of the best dyes for the shades that suited her best either were not available in Konoha, or tended to change too much when moist. So he'd had to learn how to mix his own, and with the new palette available, he'd been having to redo most of her wardrobe to take advantage of the new set of pigments. Ino was taking advantage of those fittings to get chatty. Yeah, about the only thing that could make your full-service tailoring any better was if you also ran a spa while you did it. Naruto nodded, going back to checking out the drape over her breasts. So, what would that involve? Ino groaned in pleasure, as one Naruto massaged her back while another ran brushes with scented oils through her hair, as a third measured her foot for the shoes she was to be wearing, thoughts of seducing the young tailor going through her mind. Sasuke? Sasuke who? Who was he and what did he matter? The best catch in all of Konoha was making her outfits right now. Naruto, she murmured out, awash in pleasure. Will you marry me? Naruto, Tenten, Hinata, Temari, Anko, several other girls each in their turn murmured out, awash in pleasure. Will you marry me? The boy nervously sweat dropped. No, kid, you shouldn't marry a girl who proposed just because you gave her a nice meal, a spa trip, and a few outfits, Anko instructed the lad, plainly ignorant that she was one of those herself. Any girl who'd propose just because you overloaded her senses and pleasure wouldn't make you a very good wife. She'd probably explode into fat anyway. Why do you ask? Because they're all like that, the boy confessed, stressed out of his mind. I can't even brush their hair anymore without them offering to let me do things to them. What he was ignoring was that he only ever offered to brush their hair unless it was during one of those fitting sessions where they'd just gotten a massage, there was soft music playing in the background, scented candles were burning and new clothing was dangling before their eyes. Naruto had been experimenting around with his days for some time now, and getting more training time from Anko was one of his priorities. So far, his usual schedule worked out to waking up, going directly to the Uchiha estate to look for Sasuke, getting arrested and taken before the Hokage, who gave him those properties after a little prompting. That maximized his usage of those resources those days he was studying things there. Then he went and popped by Hinata's place, woke her up and after smuggling her out of her house had breakfast with her before walking to the center together. Some of his clones would be engaging Temari or Tenten in conversation as those groups left to go to the center. Then they all met, took the test, passed with flying colors, and went off to study whatever activity had engaged his interest of late. Lately he was trying to maximize his time with Anko, as she was more than willing to teach him things. That temporary paralysis was the first actual combat technique anyone had taught him, ever. But that was only the first. She seemed to take delight in showing him how to be a more powerful ninja, and he was ecstatic to learn. Although, he was a bit hesitant to tell her everything he could do. The one time he had told her about his S-rank transformation, she had grabbed him in a hug, put his hand on one of her parts, and whispered hotly in his ear, "How'd you like to be a daddy?" He'd nearly died from the nosebleed. Then he'd go on to meet his team at the forest. Tenten would have spread news of the test, so Sasuke would go face Gaara, and Naruto would prompt Sakura to save his life, but she would not manage to preserve his eyes or balls, still a never-ending source of humor, and then it would be off to the tower, where Naruto could hang out a whole extra week with Anko. Strangely, Orochimaru never showed up to face them when Gaara was there, and didn't seem interested in marking a blind, gelded Sasuke after that. Everyone met before the Forest of Death in one large group while Anko, who had not yet met Naruto on this reset, explained the rules. Naruto made fun of the seriousness of her warning, as he had the first time, and she threw a kunai at him to cut his cheek, as per usual. Then, when she came up to retrieve it and whisper threats in his ear, as part of his efforts to get her as an instructor earlier, he twisted about in her grasp and started to whisper to her instead. After listening for a few moments to his appeal for help training so he could defeat Orochimaru, and his list of techniques he could use to do so, she pondered for a second. Then he heard a pop and felt something weird while hearing some odd squeaking. "What are you doing?" he asked her, not able to see. Anko, putting the cap back on her marker, looked at him. "Oh? Just write property of Anko Mitarashi on your butt. Don't die in there, okay, kiddo? The boy sighed, drooping his head and shoulders. Better add, and Hinata Hyuga to that too. She's my official girlfriend. And Temari! The female out of the sand siblings cupped her hands to yell across the lawn. Oh yeah, this was one of those resets where she'd sat with him and had that discussion with Hinata after the test. Resigned, Naruto gave a nod of his head, accepting that too. Giggling, Tenten added her own shout. Don't forget Tenten too. I had dibs before the sand chick did. Sakura was goggling at her despised teammate who was suddenly so popular with girls, while Sasuke ignored it all as an affront to his dignity. Wait. This is Naruto. Hiino's protest died off thoughtfully. He must be the one who gave us those outfits. Wasn't he? That's why you're doing this. Isn't it? Seeing Naruto's shy, resigned nod, Ino perked up. Wow. Is there any way I can get my name on that list? Several of the kunoichi perked up and became interested. Sticking out her tongue from the side of her mouth, Anko pulled the cap off of her marker again and bent over to do some more scribbling. Once she was done, she stood up to announce, "We can discuss sharing terms later, if any of you girls live. For now, on with the test." Okay, kid, Anko told him one day as they were out eating dango together. You've got the temporary paralysis good enough, you can master it on your own from here. Next we're going to be working on the poison mist technique. Yes. Naruto cheered, pumping a fist. That was something that could be really useful to him, ever since he'd gotten those breath masks copied. The woman smiled at his enthusiasm. Yes, the perfect student indeed. But then she frowned. Kid, you've said you've got the basic 3 and traveling 10 down, what about your essential 8? My what? He asked her. She rolled her eyes, taking her elbows off the counter to lean back, putting those same elbows on the back of her chair, which spread her coat a little wider. The essential 8 ninja skills, kiddo. Don't tell me you've never heard of them. Looking at his expression, she rolled her eyes. Okay, kid, here's the deal. Experts in any profession use shorthand names to refer to their most commonly referenced items, skills, codes, and so on. I know you know some of these. You should. The academy is supposed to teach them to every graduate, although some excel better than others. I want to know how you are at body flicker, dispel, escape, exam cheating, explosive tag use, stealth, silent killing, and wire use. Those are the essential 8. Body flicker I know almost as well as my basic 3, Naruto scratched his cheek. And I can make my own explosive tags. I can sneak around pretty good, and I'm an expert on wires. But the others? He shook his head. I don't know what some of those are. Anko groaned and touched her forehead. She loved the kid, she really did, but some of those glaring holes in his education. Okay, Squirt, here's a rundown. Dispel is an essential ability for all ninja. If you ever get caught in an illusion, and know you're caught in an illusion, which is the tricky part, you can break out by using Dispel, that is if you even know the technique. Exam cheating is the fundamental basics of all of the intrusion or spying arts to follow, a first step down the road to information gathering. Are you with me so far? Naruto nodded. Anko licked her lips, reaching into a pocket and pulling out a length of cord. We can get to the others later. For now we'll deal with escaping. You come here and let Auntie Anko tie you up. He swallowed heavily. Pondering, she reconsidered. No, let's not do this here. Come on, let's go find someplace more private. She licked her lips again, and the boy sweated. And you thought you knew explosive tags well, Anko chided him, looking on proudly as the massive fireball blew up. Naruto was also enthralled by the explosion. Wow! I had no idea it was possible to set them to go off on so many conditions. As the walls of one of Konoha's public restrooms rained down on the street around him, Anko drew the boy close to her and muttered, Yeah. They can be set to go off on any number of triggers, you've just got to know how. But, Naruto stuttered. To set them off on wanking. Kakashi stumbled, burnt and injured, out of the debris. A fire was still burning on the pages of his orange-covered book. To practice your exam cheating without going through all of the trouble to prepare a written test, I've devised this substitute. Anko told him while locking the door of her apartment closed behind her. She walked in to join him at her dining room table and put a deck of cards down in the center of it. This game is called poker, Anko told him. And to make things more interesting, we'll be playing a variant called strip poker. It's really very simple. On the board over there you'll see a list of all potential hands. You'll want to memorize it, because it'll be gone tomorrow. The person with the best hand wins, while the loser must take off a piece of clothing. The object of this exercise is to cheat, using ninja skills to find out what the other person has so you can either fold, that is drop out without playing that round, or cheat to improve what you've got in your hand. With me so far? Okay, new rule. Anko, wearing nothing but a bed sheet, told him. Even her headband was gone, all stuck in a pile before Naruto. Remind me later to take you out to a casino so you can clear out the place. But this is not about luck, or not what you should be learning, anyway. From now on, you can't win unless you write down the cards I've got in my hand before the deal is finished. Recall, this is all about spying skills. That's what we're working on for you. Naruto, sitting naked at the table, scooted closer to it so his privates were less visible and announced, "Call." "What?" he cried out when she laid down her cards. "That wasn't what I dealt you." "Of course not," she informed him with a smug grin, back to wearing all of her usual clothes, which wasn't much. Of course she'd not loaned the kid a bed sheet to wear. This is about spying, kiddo. You've got to stick with it so you don't get caught up by changing information. You cheated. He realized, blood draining from his face. Her reply was still smug as she laid her chin on her hand. Of course. We're ninja, kiddo. Cheating is part of the rules, for us at any rate. You've got to expect it. Why do you think exam cheating is part of our essential 8? Now come on, dance for me. He smiled wanly. Can I offer you a massage instead? Come back here and give me babies. Anko's voice shouted after the boy as he pelted out of her apartment. Between one step and the next, the nude boy's shape shifted into a clothed female form and kept on running. Okay. Naruto told him herself, still running. Never, ever give her a massage after an evening of strip poker. Naruto quickly learned that he could not train a whole week under Anko without her trying to jump his bones. It's not that he wasn't flattered, but the 12-year-old wasn't ready for any of that yet, so decided he needed to seek other options for his training. It's not that he'd be avoiding Anko, he just couldn't take her advances all of the time. So, to minimize his stress, he began to branch out again. Also, he was backing off of the costumes, at least for now. He'd continue to work on ideas as time permitted, but showing them off created too many problems for him. Like the Lord of Fire Country's wife pulling rank and getting him pulled out of the exams so she could have a fitting done. Of course, while it started with her, it quickly became both her, and her daughters, and her mother, and her sisters, sisters-in-law, cousins, nieces, and Naruto had been facing so many demands for new clothes, all in different styles than the village girls and Kunoichi wanted, that he wasn't quite willing to go there again soon. Gold and silver thread? He'd never even heard of such a thing before they begun demanding it for their outfits. None of the tailoring books he'd read had ever mentioned the subject. It was just too extravagant. He was going to have to discover the secrets to a whole new level of tailoring if he was going to continue to show off his creations, as it became clear to him that what nobles want, they can generally take. That is, if the Hokage pulling him out of the exam to create clothes for the Fire Lord's family was a reliable indication. And some of those women were old. Yuck. I mean, the Fire Lord's wife was almost 40. And her mother? Brrr. Then there was the long list of aunts and older cousins, and the list of grandmothers was long. No, one thing he did not know beforehand, and could happily have lived his life without ever learning, was what wrinkled on older women. No, call him a happy man who died at 20. Maybe he should declare that he wasn't able to create lingerie. Pretend he didn't do underwear so those nobles wouldn't ask? He didn't think he could bear to face another wrinkled breast or bottom. Naruto went off to take a bath and wash himself. Brrr. After that, maybe he'd start learning how to work with leather. That had to be a more manly profession than all of this lace, right? Maybe not this moment, however, as that talk among those nobles asking for feathers gave him a few ideas. He'd never thought of using those before, but if you got the right ones and used them just so, they could really add a new level of detail to certain effects. And that could require more fittings to make sure they didn't spoil the lines and still looked right. Learning to work leather was like most of the other trades Naruto had pursued. He would first find a book to read what he could, that would make it easier to find a teacher. He'd usually have to shape-shift, either into a son or other relative or into a complete stranger, but he always had to be someone who wasn't the demon container. As far as that goes, he developed a pattern of staying around just as long as he could before heading off to the bathroom, or to get a drink of water, or a breath of fresh air, any excuse to be alone for a moment so he could release the shape-shift and relax for a minute before resuming it again. It was far from perfect, and really hellaciously awkward at times, but it worked well enough to suit his needs for the present. However, as he used his remarkable intellect to further perfect his mastery of the technique, he was going increasingly long between those breaks. It was only a matter of time before he could go all day, he felt, and that would be welcome. The next goal would be to sleep all night long without releasing the shift, as it had caused a number of awkward moments during camping out in the forest of death when his companions came into his tent to wake him for his turn at watch, or whatever, and there he was wearing his foxy accessories. No, they'd lost the test more than a few times over those blow-ups, and that was after he'd started carrying in a one-man tent and insisting on sleeping alone in it, with excuses he knew from trial and error they'd believe. His current one was that he didn't want to have to watch them make out, which Sakura accepted without question, making googly eyes at the Uchiha, while Sasuke just grunted. It wasn't going to happen, but between Sakura's hopefulness and Sasuke's noncommittal grunt, they'd accepted his excuse. Then he'd had to leave a string tied to his toe trailing out the door of the tent so they could wake him for his watch turn or whatever by pulling on it. The excuse there was that he liked to sleep with traps protecting his tent, and no, he wasn't going to go into any specifics. Waking up to his toe being tugged on was always better than the screaming that came when Sakura came in on him to find his furry bits out, and it gave him a moment to sit up, rub his eyes, and put them away again before going out to meet whatever duties he had to do. It was complicated, but then nothing about his situation wasn't. But back to leatherworking. Naruto had found the best way of dealing with any trade skill was to go take whatever lesson he could get, then later go off by himself and practice that as long as he could. He usually made a few hundred clones to help him explore possibilities, like why this stitch had to be this way instead of that way, how it worked both ways, what happened if he reversed one of the pieces of cloth, or, in this case, leather, what the grain did if he shifted it about so it was facing the other way, and so on. This usually led up to a couple hundred of Naruto going over each step as he learned them, making all of the mistakes possible, and discovering the hows and whys behind each and everything, and in some cases discovering better ways of doing them. It had become obvious to the boy long ago that whatever his clones learned, he knew as well. His first impulse had been to go off to read every book in the library, but then he thought of how bored he'd be without something new every so often, and how quickly that could drive him mad, and refrained. He'd read a few dictionaries, and an encyclopedia set or two that way. They were really very interesting, and he sent clones to go back over them every so often. But the books of the library were his solace, his comfort, and his source of new stuff to liven up the same old day over, and over and over. He didn't feel like wasting that in one tremendous burst of knowledge and then nothing. No, that'd drive him mad within a week. So he kept and preserved his clones for helping him find stuff out about whatever trade or skill he'd been learning, and the best way of doing that without wasting opportunities was to use the help they gave him to reinforce whatever lessons he'd already gotten. Learning martial arts? Okay, that took on the same form of approximately a few hundred clones performing whatever lessons he'd gotten out of the ninja academy that day. Following through on one of Anko's lessons on poisons? Well, with 100 or so clones playing with every variation on that recipe, he'd learned quite a bit more than she knew about the actual formulation. And what surprised him, but shouldn't have, was that those mushrooms and things that had killed him when he'd eaten them, discovering herbs in the forest, were some of the deadliest things around, many, even, that Anko didn't know about. They had mixed dyes that way, pounded metals that way, reinforced what he was learning about Konoha history or academy skills that way. It only helped when he had them doing something different. They were all exactly like him, so if he had them doing those exercises over the same way as him, they'd all, collectively, do them exactly the same way and learn nothing more than he would have doing them alone. So, it had to be different, or else he'd gain no benefit from learning from them. But, as a side benefit of having each and every clone do everything just a touch differently in order to maximize his training, they had a phenomenal understanding of the hows and whys behind the way things worked. He'd made just about every mistake it was possible to make, and learned from them to do it better the next time he did those skilled tasks. Doing things perfectly didn't teach you much, other than to repeat those same steps the next time. Doing them wrong taught you loads. Like just what temperature that chemical dye would explode at, why you tied a knot this way instead of that to prevent fraying, what it meant to the strength and flexibility of the metal to be pounded on this way instead of that, what shapes meant for their durability, and so on. Yes, having every spectacular failure under the sun happen to him gave the boy knowledge in many cases exceeding that of seasoned masters, because they couldn't risk it and didn't want it to blow up on them. Also, to them, failures meant lost money and lost business, and in some cases hefty repair costs. But Naruto didn't have to worry about any of that, and it improved his trades in almost all cases, as he knew exactly what he could get away with, what it all meant, and how to do it again. However, it did not help him with his chakra training because of one simple thing: they all had the exact same starting point, and all had identical minds, so without knowledge of hundreds of variations on how to practice the same technique, he was helpless to learn any more than he could have alone. If 100 of him started at the same point and ran 10 feet, they'd only be 10 feet from the starting point, not 1,000. In things like tailoring, where he could start all up and down the line examining it from every angle, that was more like a relay race where one of him stood every 10 feet, and after they'd all run 10, the one at the end stood 1,000 feet away from the one at the beginning, and all of the in-between territory got covered. But so far his chakra control training hasn't worked like that. He had only one mind, and couldn't objectively stand back to examine it from more angles than he himself could think of. It was frustrating, and why he'd gone for help so often from teachers instead of just using clones. Sometimes it mattered, like a couple hundred clones off on a couple hundred different trees all faced variations on those slopes, angles of the sun, wind, and so on that prompted him to learn in slightly different ways. That helped, but only a little more than he could have managed alone. But Konoha didn't have all that many bodies of water, and the variations were tiny. All water is more or less flat, and the rest of the environmental details didn't seem to matter as much. Even the current in that river was the same from day to day. He plucked leaves off of every plant in Konoha, and most in the surrounding forest, to get enough variation to learn that one quickly, and even so it had only helped him a little, as the particulars of whichever leaf he used weren't too terribly significant to the chakra control exercise. Although, at least there he could send some clones to perform their practice indoors, outdoors, on top of the Hokage monument, hanging by wires from trees, and so on to get the most out of their multiplied experiences. A stitch or a dye recipe could be performed hundreds of different ways. Most often chakra control could not, and so his training there suffered. Well, not exactly suffered, but was nowhere near as accelerated. Still, leatherworking stood in one of those sweet spots where there were tons of books available on the subject, dozens of teachers who could be tricked into revealing their trade secrets, and hundreds of different combinations of thickness, types, and styles of both thread and leather. So, by trying out those combinations, Naruto could be running through that material like a machine, each clone taking a different part and exploring the topic from there, which in turn gave him more material to explore the next day as those clones came up with questions he couldn't answer. It never took him more than a few weeks of his private training schedule to become a tolerably proficient professional. Mastery came soon after, often less than a month total into his training. Beyond typical mastery came soon after that, wherein he was exploring strange and atypical or neglected areas of the skill, doing what was odd just to see what happened and learning from those results. By venturing beyond the standard ways of doing things, he found a whole lot of ways not to do something, and the occasional gem of a much better method. By collecting those much better methods together, he became more skilled than practically anyone in Konoha, or perhaps the elemental countries. It was all just a matter of trying what hadn't been done before to see if any of it worked. Enough of it did that he'd learn things no one else knew. The boy didn't know everything. There were clans of masters who'd carefully cultivated their art over generations, and after centuries had discovered secrets they shared with no one. The boy from Konoha did not have access to all of the environments or materials, so could not play with everything. Nor could he think of everything by himself. His imagination, great as it was, still had limits that could not encompass every lucky break or discovery made by dozens or hundreds of minds across generations. So, he was not perfect. Still, he knew a lot. A very great deal of the secrets known to those of his home village also yielded to his repeated infiltration attempts. Plus, his skill was phenomenal, and even if he didn't personally know every secret, trick, or special recipe known in the world, he knew enough that others didn't, so he could, with ease, take his place as one who knew enough to be counted among those great clans of master craftsmen. That is, if anyone from Konoha would ever acknowledge the village pariah knowing anything useful at all. They had a blind spot there, and usually didn't want to, unless it was rubbed in their faces by something they desperately wanted. Things like clothes. Women liked clothes, and they'd liked them enough so that Naruto was, by then, sick to death of looking at them naked. Well, the ugly ones anyway. Which brought him back to the manly trade of dealing with leather. The pattern was the same as usual: learn one lesson in the morning and that afternoon use hundreds of clones to practice it from every angle, exploring all of the many different possibilities so he'd fully understand it by the time it came for him to be taught the next one on the following day. He'd never yet abandoned his exploration of a skill until he had the combined available knowledge of every practitioner he could ferret out in Konoha, plus whatever he could discover on his own. He could do this with ordinary civilian stuff. Ninja skills were far more heavily guarded, and people who taught them more suspicious in general. He touched on doing this with cooking, and had discovered the possibility of working with scents and perfumes during his work on dyes. But for now those seemed far too girly to him. He didn't need to be even more popular with the female set of Konoha, next they'd be breaking down his door. Well, whenever he revealed those skills anyway. For now, he had everything back to plain old anonymity at the start of every reset, and there were times when he was beginning to treasure that. Well, in some ways. In others it still sucked worse than pond scum. At least his mistakes didn't follow him, and he could repeat the good stuff. But what he wouldn't give for some spontaneity again. Perhaps even just a surprise or two. Of course, some surprises came that were entirely unpleasant. It did not do Naruto's feelings of masculinity any good when, some time later, shortly after he began to work in leather, Kiba's sister, Hana, wanted to get herself fitted for new outfits, this time in leather. Nor was she the only one. Ah well, at least the noble women left him alone. Of course, that could be counted on as a mixed blessing, because once he'd crested about a certain point where he'd begun to reach the same heights of skill, the noble guys wanted him to be their tailor. No way, not gonna happen. It was worth running away from Konoha and dodging Hunter Ninja for a day to avoid staring at those hairy behinds. And some of those guys had wanted lace trim on their leather too. Anko's favorite classroom was a fallen log where a teacher sat on one end and the student on the other. She loved to intermingle her lessons within the course of whatever they were doing, but it was there she gave her lectures if she wanted his full attention. Tools are the most neglected form of all the ninja arts, kiddo. Everyone wants flashy techniques, and most can recognize the value of good martial arts or illusions, while everyone is impressed with proper seals, even if only the upper-level ninja usually touch on the study of them. But most people, when you ask about tools, can think of only one or two basic ones, the kunai, or a sword or wire. She stopped to chew and swallow before looking him directly in the eye. That is a mistake. Just as bad and just as deadly as underestimating any other school of ninja arts. A ninja tool is anything a ninja could use, Naruto, Anko told her student before eating the last ball of her dango. This stick, for example. She waved the bare wood around. It's unimpressive, cheap, and looks unimportant. You could get thousands of them for the price of one kunai. But I've killed one of these, and the body is just as dead as if I'd stabbed him with a flashier weapon. But I'm not telling you to become an expert of dango stick fu. She flicked the stick and it embedded itself into a nearby tree, only she paid no attention to it as she leaned forward to address the young boy. That's a mistake I'm telling you not to make, kiddo. Now I want you to listen closely. You must never rely too much on one trick. The older ninja touched her pupil's cheek. Just about everyone in the ninja world grabs hold of one tool, be it a weapon, chain, puppets, or anything else they can think of, and spends their lives dedicated to perfecting that. To me, that's a weakness. Everything can be countered. If you devote too much time to study one art, you are vulnerable to those who've studied ways around that art. There are techniques no sword can block, bloodlines that could find any concealed puppet master, chains can be turned against you, and wires cut. Lots of good ninjas have died from being too loyal to one idea. Don't do that. She leaned back on the log, still matching gazes with her rapt pupil, who was absorbing this like a sponge. She smiled, noting that everything has a counter, kid. Not just tools, but everything. A Hyuga can use their bloodline to find a hidden puppet user, not once but every time right off the bat. But neither their fancy bloodline, nor their gentle fist style would protect them from a poisoned gas pellet you threw down at their feet. Facing an Uchiha? Pop a smoke bomb and hit him when he can't see you. Let him copy your move as you throw a grenade down. It doesn't matter unless he has his own, which he won't unless he can already use M and it isn't hard, so he's stolen nothing of value from you, then you hit him in the dark. The dark-haired woman leaned back with a smile. The arts of silent killing, striking out in the dark where neither you nor your opponent can see, were really popular back in the days when there were Uchihas all over the place. Naruto nodded to show he'd absorbed the lesson. Good, the teacher acknowledged the student's understanding. So, if you go up against a superior martial artist, let him face your puppet, or a clone, or several, or both, or loads of each, while you do something nasty like drop a wide-area ninjutsu technique on him and your clones. You can always make more clones, but once your enemy is dead he'll have a real tough time coming back from that. Naruto made a scowl. Yeah, but what about a superior martial artist who can smell which one is the real you, or kills off your clones too fast? Pop off a stink bomb, the special gave a careless shrug. Most things that give advantages can also be terrible weaknesses. If he's got a super sense of smell, use that against him. Then, while he's reeling from the shock, hit him with something hard to take him down fast. We're ninjas. Fight dirty. The blonde's eyes grew wide in understanding, and his jaw dropped wide in awe and appreciation of her devious nature. That's way past Kiba in the preliminary rounds. Anko was nodding, seeing he understood. So the trick is to be flexible. Yeah, it's good to have a sword and you'd better know how to use it if you're going to carry one. But don't be too dedicated to the way of the samurai or some guy will come along to turn that skill back on you. So if you meet someone who can beat any swordsman, don't be a swordsman when you fight him, resort to other tricks instead. Use the sword, but also use knives, needles, special moves, and chakra powers. Use wires, chains, and all that, just don't depend on them. Be ready to change tactics to better suit your situation. Now her grin widened, and she scooted closer to the boy. I said tools are neglected, but everyone carries some. Aren't you going to ask me why? He shook his head and she snorted. 'Cause you expect I'll tell you, right? He gave a fervent nod, and she smiled wider, looking out over the forest. Well, you're right. Tools are neglected, kiddo, because nobody thinks much about them. They look to other things to solve their problems, when just about all situations can be answered by having the right tool. Once more she scooted closer while pretending to study the scenery. Say you need someone captured. Wires will do your work for you better than most flashy techniques. Someone is better than you in martial arts? Use a puppet to draw him in, glue him to the floor so he can't touch you. Or blow his knees out from under him. Explosive tags are the solution to so many problems, and a decent placement of one can equalize a lot of weakness in other areas. Don't be afraid to use the environment against an enemy. In fact, go out of your way to create environments that favor you over your enemy. It'll pay off in the long run, believe me. Remember, she touched his nose to emphasize her point, everything is a tool. Don't be afraid to use M. And when you come right down to it, tools are just as useful and varied as chakra techniques, and just like those special moves, the more you know the more powerful you'll be. Right. Naruto nodded fervently. Anko concealed a glance down to the untouched dango stick in his hands, almost sorrowing, as she'd intended to stop this lesson on a high note by jumping him, but it looked like the paralysis drops she'd put in his food were going to go to waste today. Pity, as she'd this long speech prepared to give him about how tools could even be used to break long dry spells or lose that pesky virginity. Unbeknownst to her, he'd heard it before, many times, each under slightly different circumstances and after completely different lectures that he'd prompted by asking completely different questions. A few had been on various aspects of torture and interrogation, several had been upon use of poisons. However, this was the first focus solely on tools in general, and the previous ones did not include that bit about using stink bombs to get past Kiba and into the finals. Naruto was going to beat Kiba. It was a mighty plan, and it was with unspeakable relief that Naruto set about performing it. Everything had to be perfect. Naruto was so excited he could hardly contain himself. A big part of the reason he'd never thought about using a stink bomb to defeat Kiba was that he'd only ever thought in terms of things he'd had or used before, and mildly costly, disposable ninja equipment hadn't been top on his list when it had already been so hard to get a decent kunai. However, for what he had in mind, they became a reasonable expenditure. The boy even congratulated himself on his patience and forbearance, having the forethought to not jump directly into the fight he wanted to win so badly, spending a few resets getting reasonable quality stink bombs and practicing so he knew how to use them well. No point going into debt on something he hoped would get him out of the infinite time loops, and thus make him actually have to pay off those debts instead of having a reset wipe them away. And no point in placing his trust in equipment he didn't know how to use adequately. It would have been just like the former, impulsive, pre-time loop him to have pulled the thing out of his pocket for the first time during the fight where he was going to use it, and spend vital seconds struggling with the shrink wrap and reading the instructions, or fling it down without pulling the pin or something so it didn't go off. It took entering the endless resets to break him of that careless habit, but broken it was. Having gotten as much mastery of the new devices as his patience could stand, Naruto woke up on his special morning, the one he'd chosen to be the big day out of which all of the resets would end, and burst into a flurry of activity. The morning had to be perfect. One of his clones ran off to the Uchiha estate to look for Sasuke to follow through on the pattern that could get him that property. Another went off to find Hinata and extract her from her house for breakfast, and a nice chat before walking to the center with her. Others burst into flurries of activity that would follow other paths, creating the armor sets he'd devised for all of his friends. His own teammates didn't count, clothing, fairly restrained, restricted to ninja outfits only, and other essential supplies. Naruto himself, the real one, began a set of exercises that he hoped would have him fit and in shape in the month and 8 days it took to reach the third test of the exam. Practicing his martial arts so he sucked less was a big part of that. It was his ambition to have trained muscle memories of those moves by the time he had to use them. He was so impatient for all of the old stuff to pass that he could hardly stand to wait through the written exam, positively vibrating in his chair until one of the proctors marked him off a point for cheating. Then he forced himself to be calm, or at least still. Outside the testing center, some of his clones went on brewing supplies of paralysis poisons, sleep poisons, hallucinogens, almost as useful as illusion techniques for screwing up an enemy during combat, a rare few poisons that could disrupt chakra flow and control, and of course the deadly ones. Some of this collection also grew far more potent over time, so the longer you had it, the more potent it was. They stocked them in contact form, gas pellets, sticky gums that dried into nearly invisible sheens for coating weapons like kunai and darts, and even a few varieties useful only for slipping into another's food, because you never knew what kind of opportunities you'd face. Poison was a very important tool in the well-supplied ninja's arsenal. Orochimaru was immune to most poisons and had a freakish amount of resistance even to the ones Anko knew nothing about. Naruto knew, he tried them all out on each and every one he himself knew of, and those ones that did affect the snake freak, even slightly, the amazing S-rank ninja would use a chakra technique to throw off moments after being hit. Anko periodically tried to help Naruto acquire a similar resistance to poisons, but it was one of those things that had to be built up over time, even with the aid of chakra techniques to speed it along. Pity, as that was one of those things that could be enormously useful. His venomous arsenal also didn't help much in the fight against Kiba, as the dog boy would just take more and more of those energy booster pills he had, relying on the boost to his chakra and constitution to shake off most things, until it came to a point of choosing to either kill the boy through an overdose, or lose the match to the pumped-up berserker. Naruto had so far avoided choosing to kill his friend, although it had been a close call once or twice there, as his frustration and agitation over being trapped in these resets mounted. But still the boy's good sense and morals won out, knowing as he did that he'd never be able to forgive himself for killing a friend, especially if that brought him out of the reset, and it didn't get undone. Naruto was willing to put up with a very unpleasant life in order to avoid doing even more unpleasant things, even if no one would blame him for having done it during a no-holds-barred sanctioned combat match. Neji, on the other hand, was enough of a jerk that Naruto wouldn't mind using his little poison packets to drop the arrogant Hyuga bastard, and only part of that was having had to watch him beat up Hinata so many times. Finally, after what seemed an eternity of waiting, the morning of the test in the Forest of Death arrived. Determined to see it for the last time, Naruto wanted to do it right, so he showed up wearing his full outfit of ninja gear, but he also showed up late, after most of the other teams had already arrived. Not coincidentally, the other two teams of Konoha rookies were also outfitted with full sets of his newly devised equipment. Each was customized to them and their fighting styles, so they bore only a partial resemblance to Naruto. But after seeing so many of their fellow new genin teams wearing new outfits, neither Sakura nor Sasuke had much to say when they spotted Naruto also wearing his. "Oi! Sakura! Sasuke!" the blonde boy called out cheerfully, no need to fake the wide grin he'd pasted over his face. "Old man Hokage gave me an old abandoned property yesterday. Look what I found just lying around the place." Sure, it was only the raw materials that had been lying there. The unique style in which he'd put them together was all his own. But they didn't need to know that. His pair of teammates, dressed in their usual clothes as no one gave them any gifts of new equipment that day, never mind that Naruto was the only one giving them, and didn't feel either deserved it, gave him a slightly sullen once-over that turned into a far more detailed examination. Gone was the normal orange jumpsuit. Oh, the blonde genin still wore orange, he just wore it in a completely different pattern, one based on tiger stripes as having been snuck up on by the tigers in the forest too many times to count. The repeating boy knew it to be an effectual camouflage pattern. Nor was it one solid color of orange, but rather a gradually shifting shade that started out fairly light and grew darker, eventually becoming a dusky red towards the back. Again, that was based on his experience with those tigers. And having tested it out more than a few times, he knew from experience that it made him much harder to spot in the forest's environs. Also, in place of the jumpsuit was a tabard and cloak design. Naruto did this for the very simple reason that it concealed his armor and prevented light from glinting off the metal. Also, by keeping the light from shining directly on those plates, it stayed cooler overall, and thus much easier to wear. For that same reason, he'd attached over sleeves and leggings of light, blousy material that added effectively no weight, wouldn't cut or bind easily, yet completed the harmless covering concealing his armored nature. Holding the tabard close to his body was a belt whose buckle was in the shape of Konoha's leaf symbol, a symbol that got repeated in tiger stripes on the center of his chest. The boy wore no helmet for now, but when he did could conceal that under a turban, hood, or head cloth like those from sand wore to keep dust from mixing with the sweat of their hair, and with a drape down the back for keeping the sun off of their necks. With the armor concealed, that was all they could see aside from the wide belt and criss-crossed front and back bandoliers covered with pockets, all of which were stuffed with useful ninja tools, from saban, shuriken and wire spools on up to bags of smoke pellets, stink bombs and a decent supply of poisons. A holster full of kunai hung from either hip. Those were just the immediate use items, the grab-it-and-go arsenal of rapid access tools meant for dealing with most occasions. He had many more, multiple reloads on up to several puppets he'd created. He was by no means a master of that art, yet, but the ones he'd crafted for himself were tolerable by most any standard, on storage scrolls hidden in chest pockets. All of this, from his bandoliers to his pockets, matched his camo pattern perfectly, blending to where it was hard to notice upon the rest of his outfit. The cloak, open front though it may have been, had folds that made it far from obvious the extent of the arsenal he was carrying. Just like it should be. Naruto approached his team with his head uncovered, partly so they could get a good look and know it was him, but also because it was so much fun to grin and see their faces contort in response to his expressions. You gotta have the simple joys in life. "You found that lying around your new place?" Sakura demanded, disbelief evident in her voice. "You look like a bad carpet, or a tasteless rug." That was unflattering, but to a certain extent true. He hadn't been able to use any shiny fabrics to make his new clothes, as the glints would too readily give him away when he was hiding. So it had all been textured cloths used in their creation, to better match the hairy pattern of a tiger in breaking up and refusing to return a strong image in shadowy light. Still, he looked far from bad in those new clothes, so the insult was far from warranted. Even in their practicality, the outfit looked good, which was quite an achievement in a stealth suit like that one. Sasuke grunted, looking away, having no comment. "The object of this mission is to stay alive, Haruno-san," Naruto told her with a mildly cold glance. "Not to look good." Then the moment was broken by Ino's squeal as she grabbed his arm and told him how he looked good. "Naruto, I've got to thank you for our new outfits. Mine fit me like a glove, and Choji and Shikamaru almost looked presentable for once. Ooh, I see you've got some new clothes yourself." Sakura stared as her former best friend jabbered before asking her, "What are you wearing?" "Oh, my new ninja outfit. Naruto gave it to me, do you like it?" The blonde girl did a little spin to show off her new attire. Having to serve most of the same needs, it had most of the same basic appearance as Naruto's, with the cloak and tabard with leggings and extra sleeves effect. However, hers was done in a deep bluish purple that was almost black depending upon how the light struck it, like a panther. She even had a cowl with a pair of cat ears on it. But instead of carrying his vast array of tools, her belt loops supported a pair of sheathed swords. Sasuke had turned a hard gaze to his teammate, and the fangirl joyously squealed over her new ninja uniform. In low, suspicious tones, he told them, "There was a clank when you two touched." "What is it?" "Body armor," Naruto told him shortly, with a shrug. He tapped his chest twice, producing a metal click each time, dulled by the layers of intervening cloth. "Since it's a life or death struggle today, we figured it would be a good idea to have something other than our skins to stop blows with." Ino hated to be anywhere near where Sasuke was sending such a hostile gaze, so she quickly excused herself. Sorry. Gotta run. My team's waiting and it looks like they're about to start the test." And with that, she vanished back over to where Choji was eating potato chips in his false fire specialist garb, and Shikamaru, wearing an outfit similar to Ino's, had removed his cloak and tabard, as if casually, but truly in a carefully calculated and deliberate attempt to let the rest of the assembled genin see how heavily armored he was underneath that disguise. It was working. There were several teams making obvious mental notes of which genin teams had such members, and one could see the gears turning as they simply assumed anyone in those outfits was heavily armored. It was a true assumption. What was perhaps incorrect about the conclusions they were drawing was that those so armored had to be close combat ninja, and tricking them into making that assumption was a good part of why the lazy boy on Ino's team had exerted himself to remove those parts to expose his armor, as letting them think he was a close combat expert improved his chances to survive the upcoming test. Many would now avoid him who might otherwise have beaten him. Ino's departure did not immediately exempt her from Sasuke's gaze, as the boy followed her with his eyes upon catching sight of where she was going, and what her teammate, and thus by inference probably her, was wearing. Naruto had spared no effort or expense in making those suits of armor. With the helmet on, the body was covered from head to toe in interlocking metal plates of exacting standards and intricate design. In some places it was joined in a segmented fashion based on a lobster's tail, in others tiny links of almost delicate-seeming chain mail that also incorporated equally tiny scales overlapping like those of a fish. That was a general overview available at a glance. Even to non-experts those sets were obviously well crafted, for all of their strangeness. But neither Sasuke, nor any of those other observing genin, had much time for a close study of all of those parts as, sensing their attention shift toward looking for weaknesses, Shikamaru once again donned his extra coverings. Naruto grinned. The armor was surprisingly comfortable to wear and flexible to fight in, but also surprisingly quiet for all the metal joints involved. It was perhaps lighter than he would have liked, not having the same stopping power as it could have if he'd used thicker plates. But none of those who would be wearing it that day were particularly strong, either, and they couldn't afford to lose their mobility lumbering about like bricks. For one reason, if they did so it would give them away as not being combat experts, who also had to be able to move to fight effectively in their armor. Still, it was stronger than one might think if they judged solely by its weight. It would take a good blow from a strong arm to penetrate, and it would take a better shot than most ninja in combat were likely to get. Even so, the blow could not go very far through the metal unless there was far more force involved than most of those assembled were likely to muster. It would have been both heavier and stronger, save for the fact that those who now wore it could not bear very much weight. So sacrifices had to be made in order to preserve mobility and maximize flexibility. Orochimaru could blow through the stuff like tinfoil, either with his sword or using jutsu, as Naruto knew from close, personal experience. Anyone else, though, had a more than decent chance of being stopped. It even made his shadow clones harder, as a strike had to penetrate the duplicate's body to disrupt its chakra system to dispel it. A heavy enough blow could still cause enough of a bruise to do it despite the armor, but nevertheless it required more than it used to kill one of them when they had his armor on. And it looked dang impressive. Although, one drawback it had, as Naruto considered what his future plans were, was that it could not be worn effectively with a vest, as the thick cloth of those flak jackets would put enough pressure on the outside of those plates to make movement inside of them very difficult. Oh well. He'd solved the problem in real time. And as he resolved to do so, his grin grew even wider. Sakura huffed, suddenly jealous now that she knew about Ino's advantage in having armor. It looked so expensive, too. Crossing her arms, she declared, "She looks happy. Naruto, didn't she say she got that get-up from you?" The blonde boy on her team answered with a shrug, his grin never faltering a moment. "You'd be surprised what you'd find around the old place I got hold of. Like these, for instance." He held up a bag of jutsu scrolls, conveniently lifted from Sasuke's apartment. "What are those?" The pink-haired girl blinked, peering at them more closely while Sasuke pretended he wasn't noticing or looking at himself. "Ninja techniques," Naruto shouted brightly. "I was up all night practicing them," he declared, glad to have discovered that little lie covered him from all sorts of suspicion as he used them, without putting any pressure on him to know them well enough to rely on in combat. He had his limiters on, but was hoping not to use them. "Oh," Sakura mumbled, put back and humbled by this, suddenly feeling outclassed as a ninja. She'd always placed her value on their team as being more than Naruto's, but with those new techniques. She tried to firm up her opinion of herself by saying there was no way he could have mastered them except she knew the story of him learning a level technique in just a few hours one night. And there was that armor he must be wearing under that new outfit. That gave an advantage. Very quickly the pink-haired one found herself questioning her place on the team, wondering what she offered to them. The only role Naruto had to play in the defeat of Orochimaru was to hang back and taunt Sasuke to get him upset enough to fight hard and impress the freaky missing ninja with the Uchiha's potential. That was all. And a clone could do that much, no problem, so Naruto felt free to explore the rest of the forest to see how everyone was doing. He also had clones doing this, of course. He'd been tracking some teams all along. But still, it felt different somehow to have his own eyes experience something. Also, it gave him a chance to stop and make info cards about the various plants and animals he encountered. It was no use trying to stock a library of them before, as the resets had always erased them. But still, he could get the experts back in Konoha to explain what they knew of those plants when he took back images of them and described the ground and stuff they were in, and that was always useful. However, this time he had a rather large clone army doing those cards, as this time there was an excellent chance for him to do it right and for there to be no more resets. So he wanted his library? That thought was making him positively giddy. Today the real Naruto was going to watch Gaara defeat a strong rain team again. That technique the lead rain ninja used, guiding about thousands of Saban needles without using wire, had been fascinating to the young blonde for some time. And between what he'd observed so far and that book on chakra control theory from the ABNU teacher library, he was almost close to being able to create his own version. And, as the rain ninja using it declared, guiding thousands of needles to their targets just using your chakra sounded deadly. Well, deadly to anyone but Gaara. Naruto got back to the camp Sakura made to guard Sasuke's feverish body just as the team from Sound were making their attack. He waited until Lee jumped in to rescue Sakura before making his own attack from behind the trio from Sound, catching the guy with pipes through his arms in a dragon flame projection just as the guy was about to act to save his teammate from dying by Lee's primary lotus. The distraction proved fatal to the Sound ninja in Lee's grasp, as he fell on his head and his skull exploded. It wasn't a good time to be the guy with pipes down his arms, either, as he got a fairly serious roasting by Naruto, who'd stayed calm through this whole exchange by virtue of having been through it many times before, and so didn't get excited enough to overload his limiters. The Sound team was defeated, and the scroll destroyed by Orochimaru, a fake Naruto had planted for that purpose. Team 7 had both of the scrolls they needed to pass, so could go on directly to the tower. Sakura, concerned for Sasuke's health, demanded they do so in order for him to get medical attention. Naruto, who was able to provide such attention, said nothing, but formed two clones and carried the Uchiha there on a stretcher, not even jostling him as they avoided the teams that lay in wait around the tower, trying to catch those on their way there with scrolls. None of those were able to surprise him, as too many already had. So he memorized all of their patrol and ambush patterns. And that put them firmly in place to wait for the preliminaries. Of course the prelim fights are rigged, Anko told him once. We're ninja, kiddo. Unless you're looking underneath the surface you're not seeing the real story at all. All it takes is a very minor lightning jutsu to adjust those results to be whatever you want them to be. So I could, Naruto began eagerly. Not likely, kid, Anko snorted, cutting him off. Sarutobi plans to be there himself, adjusting the matches. Unless you've got Kage-level skills at subtle manipulation of the random choice system, you can forget it. Naruto had tried, of course, but so far he hadn't found out even what jutsu they used. However, that hadn't been the end of that conversation. But then, why? Are the fights so unmatched? Anko finished his sentence for him. Look at it this way, kiddo. All non-hostile ninja countries openly send representatives to watch our exam final matches to get a gauge of our strength, and a ton of our own and allied nobility show up as well. We can't afford to look weak. So, the head examiner, or the Hokage when he's present, selects strong ones to go on by giving them weak opponents. They make sure to have our best going out before the stadium audience, while the weak, or stupid who just got lucky get eliminated in private before anything could embarrass us. But Naruto's eyes had widened in horror. Kiba is strong, and he stopped, unable to complete his sentence. Anko gave the boy's hair a ruffle, unable to sense why he should be so horrified at that thought. Yeah, the dog user is a good candidate for, so I'm sure the Hokage will match him up against someone weak so he can go on. Don't worry about it. The prelim matches are still a week away. Well, for her they'd been. Naruto, who'd already been through them many times before, just got faced with the thought that the Hokage felt he was weak, as he'd put him up against Kiba to pass the dog user. He swallowed, trying to disguise how much that hurt. So, who am I likely to go up against? Anko put a finger to her lip and thought about it. Finally she shrugged, and put on a smile for him, ruffling his hair. Oh, kid. Don't be so impatient. You'll get someone weak, I'm certain. But even then he knew she'd been lying, trying to comfort him. It didn't make sense, as she knew he was stronger than most of the genin out there, even stronger than a few of their, when he had his limiters working, that is, but as she'd never seen him in a real fight with his emotions going that reset, they'd always been up, so she should have been just as certain of his strength. So he'd been mystified as to why she had no faith in his ability to pass. But still, that explained why his many efforts to stir things up a bit by helping to control who got what scrolls in the forest hadn't helped as much as he'd hoped they could. But the boy pressed, still very much confused. What happens when a strong person fights someone strong? Or when two weak ninja fight? Anko had chuckled, ruffling his hair once again before whispering in his ear. Naruto, that usually happens when Sarutobi misjudges someone. Think about it, he doesn't have time to personally get to know every candidate in the village. He has to rely on reports given by teachers and team leaders, who sometimes write glowing, flattering reviews on weak ninja, or badmouth strong ones they don't happen to like very much. So, Ino and Sakura, Naruto stuttered. There's a good matchup, Anko declared happily. That Ino girl is part of the next generation of a famous team. I've heard their instructor bragging in the lounge about how great they'll be. So she's going to be strong, while your teammate, on the other hand, isn't. She's pretty pathetic and useless according to Kakashi's reports. So that would be a good matchup, an easy fight, getting the strong one to go to the final rounds. Naruto gave the special a significant look, telling her that he knew that Kakashi badmouthed all of his team except Sasuke, whom he praised constantly. Anko adopted an expression that said, yeah, he was right. But she was sorry he had to know that piece of data. But then she shot him a grin that said she didn't agree with Kakashi's opinions of him in the least. That was comforting. So, Lee and Gaara, he continued to ponder. Anko was nodding, pursing her lips. Yeah, that's another likely match, as no kid unable to mold chakra can be much of a ninja, but that sand kid is going to kill whoever he goes up against. So yeah, I could agree with your thoughts there, putting up the most useless of the hopefuls, probably dragged to the prelims by the rest of his team, as a sacrificial lamb to be slaughtered by the strongest and most ruthless one. Lee is actually really strong, Naruto corrected her. Really? Anko said with some surprise, raising her eyebrows. I know Guy likes to brag about him, but he's always been a little off. And if the kid can't mold chakra to create ninja techniques. Naruto almost chuckled, shaking his head. No, you don't understand. Lee's got a work ethic that could make ants blush with envy. He may have a defect stopping him from using advanced chakra techniques, but he works so hard to compensate for it that you'd be surprised at how powerful he's gotten. His martial arts are at an upper level, easily. Really? Anko had asked with some surprise. Really, the blonde confirmed, nodding. And then he can open the celestial gates to get even stronger when he needs to. Anko paused, thoughtfully. He presumed she'd gone off to tell the Hokage what he'd said because the prelim matchups had gone slightly differently that time, with Gaara facing Sakura, who bowed out in the first moments, and Lee beating up on Ino a bit until she, too, surrendered her chances. After that conversation, Naruto had watched those preliminary rounds with new eyes. Sasuke, the amazing Uchiha, always got one of the weakest opponents there was, always a one-trick pony, and usually that chakra-draining guy who went down in one hit. Neji Hyuga always got his cousin Hinata, and having watched the Hokage's face as that match progressed, Naruto got sickened. The old man was deliberately letting the strong Neji take out his frustrations on the meek and mild Hinata, testing the main house against the branch to see which was stronger. Naruto felt chilled as he'd watched the Hokage's face through those tests a few times, not even paying attention to the matches in order to better watch the Hokage's reaction to them. The old guy stood there smiling as people fought and nearly died. There was no empathy for those who were suffering. To him, they may as well have been pieces on a playing board. Naruto was both astonished and sickened. When he'd brought it up to Anko, she'd put an arm around his shoulders and told him, "Kid, the Hokage's got the worst job in all the village. He's got to send people out to fight, and sometimes they die. If he gets too worked up over it, he couldn't even do his job, and then we'd all suffer for it. So don't be too hard on the old guy. He's got to make tough choices and hard decisions all day long, every day. That's what being a Hokage is." And that thought had really soured the boy on his future career choice. But that was all in the past, something done long ago resets. Naruto knew now that he'd have to be fighting Kiba regardless of most other factors, like which teams passed on to the preliminaries from the forest. His Gramps would send him up against Kiba so Kiba could go on to fight during the final rounds. After much pondering, Naruto had decided that maybe the Hokage was even trying to be kind to him, as most of the really strong ones during the prelims wouldn't feel at all bad about maiming their foes. Kiba was comparatively gentle, he'd stop when you stopped moving. There wasn't any malice to his takedowns, unlike some others. So at least there was a little bit of kindness in being sent up against the dog user. But that did mean that the Hokage didn't feel that Naruto was ready to be and that realization hurt something awful. Well, today was the day he'd prove otherwise. Of course, that left open the question of what Sarutobi was thinking those times Naruto had been forced to go up against Gaara during the prelims. He was the one arranging those matches, so why did he do it? But Naruto was so excited about passing the preliminary matches at last that he didn't care anymore. Today he was going to beat up Kiba. The preliminary fights were going as usual. Sasuke had beaten up on the one-hit wonder from Kabuto's team before going off with Kakashi, and while waiting out the remainder of those fights, Naruto turned to Anko, who was present on account of him, and asked, "Anko, you once told me that since we are ninja, unless we are looking under the surface we aren't seeing the real story at all. Does that have something to do with what Kakashi said once, about looking underneath the underneath?" The special looked at her prodigy, somewhat amazed. "He was telling you guys that garbage without explaining it? What kind of a teacher is he?" "No, don't answer. We'll get to that in a moment. Yeah, that's some crock he's worked up, a short form of something the fourth Hokage once said, that civilians look on the surface, while ninjas see reasons underneath. But to be the best of ninja, we must look beyond even that." But, of course, Kakashi managed to cut it down to a trite phrase that doesn't mean anything unless you know the whole story behind it. Sheesh. The woman rolled her eyes. Curious about her previous statement, Naruto perhaps indelicately pressed, "So, what kind of a teacher is he?" Anko looked at him, acknowledging that he was a bit rude to push it, but also that he had a right to know. She sighed, turned her back on the fights going on down below, and looked out a window and off into the forest. "Now, kid, I don't want to go deeply into exploring his screwed-up psyche, but in lots of ways Kakashi has always struck me as something of a coward. Porn is no comparison to a real partner, and he is the legendary copy Nin. Being famous and powerful, and being an elite, so very well paid for his services, picking up chicks should not be outside his ability. You know why he doesn't? I think he's scared too." Scared too? Naruto blinked, not understanding. Anko just shrugged. Let people close and they can hurt you, or die and that hurts even worse. But no, he avoids that, and has effectively no close friends or love interests. It's pretty amazingly plain that he lives in the past as much as possible, and that is the redoubt of someone who cannot take the life they've got today. Since he is notably lacking in most problems others might retreat in the face of, he's chosen to do so not because today is bad, but that he feels yesterday was better. The special watch leaves blow by as they swirled in the breeze. That is the course of action of a coward. A real man would face up to what he's got and work to make it better. Lost your girlfriend? Fine. Move on. The next one you get may even be better. Lost your best friend? Make another. Mentor? Well, they all die eventually. Move on. Everything in life has changed. If you can't deal with change, you can't deal with life. And his lack of training, either for himself or his team, is yet another symptom of his inability to face the present. He isn't trying to improve what he's got, he's too busy reminiscing about what's over and gone. She snorted ruefully. I can't tell you how many times I, or another of the, have wanted to beat the tar out of him and tell the lazy need to grow up. It's been, in my mind, far overdue. I've lost people closer to me than Kakashi ever has, and he's got no excuse for wallowing in self-pity over it how many years later? The dark-haired lady turned her attention back to her student. Yes, I've lost people I loved. Yes, I've lost close friends. Yes, I've even lost family, and what happened with my mentor makes me wish he was dead. It hurts, and you grieve for a couple months or so, and then you get over it. This conversation got interrupted by Kiba's cry of triumph over being paired up in the next fight against Naruto. Anko's student turned away from her cut-short lecture to see that almost half of the genin on the balcony had been staring at him as he'd been tutored by Anko. Naruto shrugged. They'd get over it on the next reset. Or actually, he gave a feral grin and jumped off of the balcony. They wouldn't. Because he was going to beat Kiba today. Naruto looked across the floor to his current nemesis. While Kiba hadn't put him through nearly the grief Orochimaru had, still, it was the dog user at present who was holding him back. Don't think I'm going to go easy on you, Naruto taunted his opponent. Kiba snorted disdainfully. Don't make me laugh. Kiba's dog yipped in agreement from atop the boy's head. Begin! The head examiner cried, slashing his arm downward before the fight could start without him. The fight had been brutal. He still recalled Kiba's mocking words, You think no one's ever used a stink bomb on my family before, Uzumaki? I could smell you carrying those bombs before we even went into the forest. Then the dog user had activated a flash protection jutsu that kept him safe from sudden overpowering smells. Naruto guessed that the dog user hadn't felt he needed that the first time they'd fought, when he hadn't been carrying any ninja gear except a few shuriken and kunai. So yes, Kiba had known about his whole arsenal, about the smoke and bombs, especially the poisons, but also even his kunai and wires. It had to be awesome to have such a nose. The guy had to be hard to surprise by virtually anything. Well, anything except a fart, but biologies are working all of the time, so unless you'd had beans for breakfast and were churning them out reliably, those could catch an Inuzuka off guard. That had upset Naruto, who'd begun to use explosive tags. Not just a few, but a lot. He'd set them off knowing he'd get caught in the blast zone, not even caring about the damage he'd received, as it would all get better anyway. The building had come down, but he'd won the fight. Only it hadn't been the explosive tags so much that had done it. No, Naruto had started to use body switches to pull other things into his place just when Kiba was about to hit him. He'd started off with stones and logs, but pretty soon he'd gotten creative and Kiba was punching at him only to suddenly hit a very surprised head examiner, or Kakashi, or the Hokage. In the face. Hard. Several times. Naruto repeated those switches over and over again. Then he'd gone a little nuts, and using his wires, had grabbed Sasuke off of the witness balcony, and used him as a mace to club at Kiba, missing more often than not, but still very satisfied to be smashing the Uchiha about like a mace, smashing apart the walls and even injuring that big stone statue some. Sakura had called out fierce objections, only to get caught by more wires and added to the fun. Maybe her face would look normal someday, if the medics cared enough to fix it, but maybe not. The Uchiha was never going to be pretty again. After Kiba had cut his wires, both scared and ashamed of Naruto for his brutal treatment of his teammates, they'd gotten to play explosive tag again, with the dog user this time frantically trying to avoid getting the two down genin caught in the multitude of blasts. Kiba had quit after not so much of that, rather than see Sasuke and Sakura subjected to more explosions. After he'd come down off of his "don't you dare take my hopes away" rampage, Naruto had been ashamed of himself as well. Some of the rookie genin had called out objections from the balcony, that it wasn't fair for Naruto to involve so many other people in his own fight, but Naruto's short, curt, "A ninja tool is anything a ninja uses," the head examiner had agreed, around his bruises, and quickly called the match in Naruto's favor. But it had been immensely unsatisfying, and Naruto was filled with shame over having lost control like that, especially so early on. He was a better man than that, or at least he tried to be. Batting his disappointment in his own behavior aside, Naruto went on to the month between the prelim matches and the finals with the air of a kid in a candy store. Everything was new. Things were different. People were moving about in ways that he hadn't seen before, saying things that he hadn't heard before. Oh, it was great! The entire month passed so quickly that he didn't quite know what to do with himself. He caught himself thinking, when this happens again, I'll only to get cut off by the fact that he knew that it all wouldn't be happening again. He was completely unprepared for how quickly those days passed. It was like a dream. One moment he had a whole month before him, and the next the third test of the exam was upon him. He didn't know how to deal with it, and was shocked that it all passed him by so swiftly. So, sooner than he would have believed, he was there in the arena, with Anko there helping him get ready for the final phase of the exam. Naruto put on his armor, and to his surprise it was too tight, constricting and binding, pinching and in all other ways uncomfortable. Anko laughed at his astonishment. Whoever made that set wasn't very good. It's too small. But it fits perfectly, the boy protested, not understanding it. Anko leaned down to poke him in the breastplate. Maybe. But whoever made it forgot to put in any tolerances. You're 12 years old, kiddo. You grow. You shoot up like a weed, even if you don't notice it. This stuff may have fit when you first put it on, but that was how long ago? 9K. A month and 8 days, he replied exactly, as it had been exactly a month wait since the preliminaries, a week for the Forest of Death, and a day for the written test, which is the day he most often repeated, and so used to make his measurements and design it. Anko grunted thoughtfully. Still had to have been pretty tight when it was made for you to have so little room for growth. Okay, Naruto sighed within himself. That was an obvious blind spot. He shouldn't let himself be too surprised. He didn't grow or change during the repeats, so he'd forgotten to account for it. No big deal. That probably meant all of his clothes and things made for himself, and others had the same problems, no room for growth. Well, how was he to account for a thing he'd never seen? Ever since before he'd started to have these skills, that wasn't something he could witness to account for. Thanks for watching, Shinobi Squad. If you enjoyed this what if, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss the next twist. Drop your theories in the comments, I'm always reading. Want more Naruto heat? Check out the other videos on the channel. Stay sharp, stay awesome, and remember even shadow clones need love. Peace out.